Welcome to this event, Kastrup, everybody else listening. My name is Jack. I'm co-hosting this Ask Me Anything with Bernardo Kastrup. This is my first time, so if I sound amateuristic, that is because I am. Um, Roman, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, this is my first time co-hosting an event as well, so I may be a bit of an amateur.
Well, so there you go, Bernardo. So I'm afraid your patience will be tested a little bit more tonight.
It's all good.
It's all good, thank
Thanks
you.
for taking the time to do this. It means a lot.
No problem. It's my pleasure.
It's good to hear your voice. You have such a soothing voice, by the way. So I'm immediately calm. I was a bit nervous when things weren't going to plan a couple of minutes ago, but so for everybody listening, this event is private. Well, it's semi-private, so you will be listening in. You can ask questions if you like. This is live, but it's not being live broadcasted anywhere else. But we do want to record this. So if you want to ask a question, you can. There's a request to speak button located at the bottom. It's a hand icon. You can just click that, and you guys will queue up for questions. If you don't, that's fine. We have a lot of questions from you guys. We have, I think, about 100 questions, and I asked my friend Raman to do the first question. But first, let's just introduce Bernardo. I don't think it's necessary, but still will. So today with us is Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, Executive Director of Essentia Foundation, who has a PhD in Computer Engineering and Philosophy of Mind. He is known for works like his books Why Materialism is Baloney, The Idea of the World, and Science Ideated, where he lays out a comprehensive and hard-nosed argument for why reality is mental. Is that fair, Kastrup?
It's fair enough.
Fair
It's all
enough. Try to keep it short. Raman, anything to add to that?
No, that seems fair.
Cool. Well, if we're all ready, Raman, would you
Well,
like?
let me begin by asking Dr. Kastrup to give a brief summary of his position.
That would be helpful.
Okay. My position is analytic idealism, and the notion is that the world out there, it really exists. There is a reality outside and independent of our personal minds. But that reality, in my view, is mental in essence. And it's very easy to conceive of that. If you can conceive that another person has mental inner life, even though it's not accessible to you, then you can conceive that there is mental inner life in the world at large, although it's not directly accessible to you as an individual mind. And what we call the physical world, in my view, is just a representation, an appearance of these transpersonal mental processes that constitute the world as it is in itself. In the same way that your tears are the appearance of the inner sadness that you experience. So from my perspective, all matter, is just what inner mental processes look like when observed from the outside. Or more technically, matter is the extrinsic appearance of mentation when observed or experienced from across a dissociative boundary. So that's it in a nutshell.
Raman?
Thank you. Well, I'd like to start with the audience questions. Here's a question from James the Wise. It doesn't have anything to do with metaphysics. It's more about you personally. So he asks, what school of economics do you subscribe to? And do you think capitalism is sustainable, or is socialism the future of humanity?
I don't know enough of economics to tell you, to give you a definite position. But I will answer a part of your question. Capitalism, as we have it implemented today, I think is vastly unsustainable. It is definitely not optimal, but then most systems are not optimal. But in the case of capitalism, it is not optimal to the point that if we insist on it, I don't think civilization will last very much longer. Socialism, I don't know exactly what socialism is. Was the Soviet Union socialist? Communist? I don't know. I'm not an expert, but I can definitely imagine that there are many more than just two options on the table. We've gotten used to sort of dividing the space of solutions for everything in just two quadrants, communism or capitalism or democracy or something else, and left and right and liberal and conservative. Unfortunately, or very fortunately, the world is a lot more complex than that. Things are not restricted to only two dichotomous categories. So I think the optimal economic system is something that we should sit, discuss with an open mind, not driven by personal agendas or power politics, and come up with a set of rules and values and incentives and discouragements that make the most sense. And then what name it will gain, what name it should have, I don't care. Call it X. I don't give a damn what the name is, so long as it is conducive to human creativity, to human drive, and conducive to safety, decency, human rights, and a productive overall community life.
That sounds reasonable. Well, I'll go ahead with a few more questions and then leave it to my co-host, Jack.
All right.
So, what do you think about superdeterminism as a way to preserve physical realism under the face of the experiments of quantum mechanics? I know you've recently addressed this.
Yeah, hours ago, I published an extensive essay talking about it. I think superdeterminism is a fantasy. It's comparable to the epicycles that tried to save Ptolemaic astronomy, the notion that the celestial bodies move according to perfect circles, because that was the metaphysical commitment of the time. Observation showed that okay, that's not the case. So people started, coming up with epicycles or circles within circles, circles moving along or the boundaries of other circles to try to accommodate the anomalies. But at some point, the whole thing becomes unsustainable. And I think superdeterminism is just the epicycles of physicalism. It's a precarious, tortuous, fantastic, and incredibly implausible attempt to safeguard physicalist metaphysical intuitions. In other words, to safeguard the notion that physical entities have standalone, absolute, independent existence. While experiments are showing us again and again for about 45 years now, 43, that that is not the case. Superdeterminism, as put forward by Sabine Hossenfelder recently, is a hand-wavy attempt to say that there must be something, we don't know what, that somehow, we don't know how, does what we needed to do so we can safeguard our metaphysical commitments. And she also fails to address a lot of the most relevant recent technical literature. She talks about Bell's inequalities, but ignores Laget's inequalities, much more recent work from 2003, much more relevant to the issues in contention. She fails to address the multiple experimental confirmations of Laget's inequalities, which have refuted physical realism specifically, not only the combination of physicalism and locality and statistical independence and all that, but realism specifically. She fails to comment on that. She failed to comment on two extraordinarily significant recent results, one about Wigner's friend experiment, and the other one about relational quantum mechanics, that have shown that the physical world is not absolute, it is relative. The technical word is it is contextual or relational, whatever you want to call it. The physical world is like movement. If you are in a train traveling at speed, then you are not moving with respect to the train, but you are moving with respect to the train platform that you've left behind. Movement is relative. And the physical world, physical entities, quantum particles, they are relative in that exact same way. They are one thing from one perspective, they are something else from another perspective, which shows that the physical world is just an appearance. It's it's the way a deeper layer of reality presents itself to observation. It's like the values on the dials of a dashboard in an airplane. If the airplane sensors are not measuring the world outside, the real world, the dials display nothing because the dials display only the results of measurements. That's what the physical world is. It's what is on the dials. Um, the fact that there is no physical world when there is no measurement doesn't tell you that there is no real world outside. You know, if the airplane sensors are not measuring the world outside, the dials inside on the dashboard show nothing. That doesn't mean that the airplane is not in the sky or that there is no sky. It only means that the world which exists isn't physical. It is something else. And physicality is just the way that something else presents itself to observation or to measurement. It is a representation of a deeper layer of reality.
All right, I'll move on to the next question, which is by Prince Fluff. So, does idealism allow for free will in the robust sense of could have done otherwise if the universe were rewound?
It does allow for it. It's probably, of all the metaphysical options on the table today, it is the one that allows the most for free will, because it's basically saying that the mental processes, such as tastes, preferences, personality traits, inclinations, dispositions, those mental processes that we like to think of as determining our choices. I like to think of my choices as having been determined by my tastes, my dispositions, my personality traits, and not the neurophysiology of my brain. Under analytic idealism, your choices are determined by these mental processes that you do identify with your tastes, your personality traits, your preferences, predilections, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, it does. I personally think the whole question of free will is a bit of a red herring, because even if your choices are determined by mental processes that you do identify with, such as your felt tastes, your felt inclinations, personality traits, dispositions, and so on, they are still determined. They are determined by your tastes, your personality traits, and so on and so forth. The kind of free will I would like to have, I know I don't. And that free will would be the following: it would be if I were free to choose my tastes, my preferences, my personality traits, my inclinations, my preference, and so on and so forth. Because then I would be guaranteed to be the happiest person on the planet. Even if I were serving a life sentence in solitary confinement, I would still be the happiest man on the planet, because I would just choose to consider that situation as the most wonderful thing in the world. I would choose my tastes such that I would consider that wonderful. Obviously, I can't, because as Schopenhauer said, we are free to act according to our will, but we are not free to will our will. So yeah, to me, I don't choose my next thoughts. I don't choose how I feel. Otherwise, I would never have had psychological issues. I have suffered from anxiety for years. Maybe not as much anymore, but I did. I when I lost my father when I was a kid, I didn't choose to feel the way I felt. So I don't even choose what I feel I must do next. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing right now. Because if you ask me what my purely individual egotistic preference would be, my preference would be to be out of the grid, living in a wooden house, far away from everything, up in the Swiss Alps, which is a part of the world I'm very attached to because of my youth. Um, but I don't do that. I'm out in the world because I don't choose what I must do either. If I don't do what I feel I have to do, I pay a tremendous price in disquiet, in anxiety, in not being able to sleep, of feeling depressed. So yeah, do I have free will? I have free will to choose my mortgage package and the way to work in the morning. Not much more than that, I think. Which is okay. It's perfectly okay, because I don't even truly exist as a separate agent. So how could something that doesn't really exist have free will?
I think the questioner was more about asking, could the universe have been different, even if this kind of mental determinism was
Yeah.
true?
Yeah, counterfactual definiteness is the technical name for what the person is trying to ask. No, I don't think it could, because at the universal level, okay, let's assume analytic idealism is true. At the universal level, there is only one thing going on. It's one universal mind, and that universal mind, whether it knows that it's doing it or not, it's making certain choices in the sense that it's behaving certain ways and not others. But it behaves the way it does because it is what it is. The question of could it have behaved differently is exactly the same as the question of could it have been something different, which is a completely useless question. Reality is what it is. It is not something else. There is no encompassing context surrounding reality as a whole that could provide us a reference to talk about other possibilities, because reality is by definition the whole of what is. Um, so I don't think it's the correct question to ask. It's a wrong question in the same sense that asking what is the marital status of the number five is a wrong question. It's not the right question to ask. I think the universe did whatever it did over the last 3.8 billion years ago, if you believe the calculations, because it is what it is. And in that sense, no, it couldn't have done anything else because the universal mind has the dispositions it has. It has the inner conscious life and feelings and preferences and needs it has, and not others. And it has those because it is what it is and not something else.
Great. So I'll hand it over to Caleb for the next question.
Hi, Bernardo. So, as someone who's still kind of flirting with the idea of idealism, I have to know, when did you kind of discover idealism, and what was that kind of pivotal moment when you kind of started to fully believe in it?
I didn't really discover it as a ready to use system. In my early days, I was a physicalist, sort of not because I thought things through and chose physicalism, but because I was in an environment that breathed physicalism. I started working at CERN, the big particle accelerator in Switzerland. I started working there. I was 22, and I was too busy, enjoying life, getting my dream job 2 days after I defended my master thesis. I was too busy with, doing science and trying to carve out some kind of name for myself and enjoying my life to think about metaphysical questions. So I was a sort of a physicalist by default. Because I was breathing physicalism in the environment where I was, and everybody else there is doing the same. Nobody's thinking through philosophical questions. We were doing particle physics, high energy physics, nuclear physics, whatever you want to call it, and that was our life. But later on, well, already at CERN, I started working with artificial intelligence, fooling around with, prototype AIs that I tried to use to select the correct data from the experiments, something the data acquisition system needed to do anyway. And we were doing that based on our human knowledge of physics. But I started experimenting with teaching some AIs to do the same, to figure out if they too could develop enough understanding of the physics that they could tell us which part of the data was relevant and which part was not. And lo and behold, they very well could. Now, the AIs were not used back in the 90s. I don't know what the status is today. I don't think AIs are used even today. But at the time, it was because our understanding of AI was very limited. We could train these neural networks, but we didn't quite have ways to visualize what they were doing or why they were doing what they were doing. So they were a bit of a black box, and physicists would never trust a black box to decide, whether to store or throw away data that could mean a Nobel Prize. So they used the classical algorithms that we developed. But it planted a thought in my mind: if I can make an AI that is as smart as a physicist to find the Higgs boson, can I make an AI that is also conscious? Because before you think these things through, intelligence and consciousness seem to go hand in hand, which is of course a completely arbitrary assumption. There is there's no reason why that would be the case, but that's how I sort of felt my way around these issues at the time. And for years I started thinking, what should I do to these artificial neural networks I'm building to make sure that they are not only intelligent, but that they are also conscious, that there is experiencing accompanying the internal calculations they perform. And the more I struggled with it, the more I realized that whatever I could do or not do, it would be only a matter of structure and function. And it would have nothing to do with experience. It would not give me any more or less reason to think that the ANN, the artificial neural network, was or wasn't conscious. The notion of experience seemed to be completely incommensurable with structure and function. But how could that be? Because apparently my neuronal networks, the biological one in my brain, are accompanied by experience. What they do is accompanied by experience. So what was wrong? And that is what sort of led me to take a few steps back and re-examine my hidden assumptions and try to find another way out, because I was just knocking my head against a wall. And that's how my philosophical journey with idealism really started. The first realization was that the assumption that consciousness is something that gets created, it had to be faulty, because it led to these internal contradictions. So it doesn't matter how intuitive and plausible it seemed to me that consciousness had to be created in the same way that children are born, it led to impossible contradictions. So it had to be wrong. And then I started thinking, okay, how can I then reform my entire worldview such that I can regard consciousness as a ontological primitive, as something fundamental in nature, but still explain that why children are born and don't seem to be conscious before that, why I can't read your thoughts and presumably you can't read mine, why if I put a bullet in my head something will happen to my conscious inner life, or if I drink alcohol something happens to my conscious inner life, or if a neurosurgeon starts poking around my brain with an electric probe, something will happen in my conscious inner life. So how can I reconcile all of these undeniable observations with the notion that consciousness is not reducible? Because pretending that it is reducible was leading me to knocking my head against a wall. And over time, this philosophy developed, and then people started telling me, you're saying the same thing that this or that person said 1800 years ago or 3,500 years ago, and these other people are saying already today. And that was great, because one of the characteristics of the truth is that it isn't fragile. Even if we don't see it, we are immersed in it, we are part of it. So it should be no surprise that other people across cultures and time have arrived at the same conclusion, that consciousness is fundamental.
Okay, so the next question is from me. You said, if I'm representing you correctly, that the results of the 2019 experiment of local observer independence scores some big fat brownie points for relational quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
However, since the results are presumably consistent with all the possible interpretations, how does this score points for RQM in particular?
RQM, it is put forward as an interpretation. I don't think it is an interpretation, because it entails, it hasn't, it is the one interpretation in which nothing is interpreted, in which the implications of quantum theory are just accepted for what they are. That's what RQM is. RQM is just an acknowledgement of the implications of quantum theory. All or most other interpretations try to say that, okay, quantum theory works in practice because of this, this, and that, but what is actually going on is this other thing. RQM is the only one that comes and says, look, if within quantum theory, two people can describe the same series of quantum events differently, and both can be simultaneously right, and this is proven. I mean, proven. Even proof sounds too grandiose for what this is. You just sort of write down the equations of quantum theory, and you realize that's what it says. Two observers can describe correctly the same series of quantum events differently. And relational quantum mechanics just accepts it. It says, okay, then that's how the world is. It means that all physical entities are relational. They are relative to the observer. And that's what I think is right, because that's what these experiments are saying. The 2019 experiment by Proietti does that quite explicitly. There is another experiment, 2020, I think, or last year. I don't remember anymore, but it's a confirmation of Wigner's friend experiment, which also shows the exact same bloody thing. So all of this hysteria about interpretations of quantum mechanics, it arises from our intuitions screaming to us that what quantum theory implies cannot be right. We have to sort of try to accommodate our expectations, our prejudices into quantum theory by interpreting it in one or another way. While the theory, which is the most empirically confirmed theory in the history of science, is very clear. It's pretty clear in what it says. Now, why do we try to deny this? Why do we try to deny that physical quantities are relational, that all physical entities, none of them has standalone existence? They are relative, like movement is relative. Why do we try to deny that? It's because we tend to think of physical entities as fundamental, as things that have standalone existence. Just in the way that the stuff that moves has standalone existence, but movement doesn't. What quantum theory is saying is that physical things are like movement, and the stuff that moves isn't physical. It is a deeper layer of reality that by definition is non-physical, because physicality is the movement, not the stuff that moves. We don't want to accept that because we want to think of physical things, physical entities, as having standalone existence. But that's just a metaphysical prejudice that has gained a lot of cultural momentum. What the experiment is telling us is that this is just not the case. Physicality is an appearance. Physicality is relational. It depends not only on the thing observed, which is not physical, but also on the observer, which itself is not physical. And out of a sort of an interaction between the two, an interference pattern, if you will, physicality emerges. Now, this is incredibly intuitive if you think about it according to a different metaphor. Think about the physical world as what is displayed on the dials of an airplane's dashboard. The airplane has several sensors making measurements of the world outside, such as air speed, air pressure, air humidity, checking whether there are storms ahead and all that, all kinds of sensors in the airplane. And the results of those measurements performed by the sensors are displayed on the dials in the airplane's dashboard inside. So, and these things are so accurate that you can fly by instrument. You don't need a transparent windshield to fly safely. You can fly purely by instruments. The dials are reliable. They are conveying accurate information about the world. But the world is not the dials. The world is the thing that is measured outside, such that the results of those measurements can appear on the dials. The physical world is the dials. If you don't make a measurement, the dials show nothing. So there is no physical world. Is this counterintuitive in any sense? It is obvious. If you don't measure anything, the dials show nothing. If you do make a measurement, the dials show something. And what the dials show is not the world. It's a representation of the world that arises from measurement. So the physical world is what shows in the dials. If you don't measure, no physical world. If you do measurement, oh yes, there is a physical world. But the physical world is not the thing measured, just as the dials are not the world outside the airplane. It is not difficult if we can sort of see through our culturally induced prejudices.
Well, all right. Caleb has one more question, and then I'll hand it over to Jack.
Hi again. So, what's your opinion on Nietzsche's view that God is dead?
I have a very complicated relationship with Nietzsche. It's a relationship of love and hate. It's like I hate the guy, but I can't let go of the guy. It is weird. I think to interpret Nietzsche correctly, we have to go beyond the statement, God is dead. We have to follow the next statement. The next statement is, God is dead and we have killed him. That is what is written, not only in Zarathustra, but in the previous, I got the book where this appeared for the first time, The Gay Science, or today the word gay has other meanings, The Joyful Wisdom. Is a better translation from the German. In The Joyful Wisdom, he already makes the statement, God is dead and we have killed him. So to interpret him correctly, you have to take both statements into account. The God that is dead is not the metaphysical God. The God that is dead is the only God we could have killed, which is our view of God, our conception of God. So what he was saying is that God, as understood by people in the mid-19th century, had been refuted by people's own ability to reason and consider evidence. Therefore, we have killed our conception of God. And that was a significant enough tragedy because when it comes to social psychology, it is our conception that matters. It is our conception that dictates how society goes forward. And Nietzsche predicted that if we no longer had a sustainable conception of something transcendent, some form of divinity that grounds and gives meaning to life, that we would end up like what he called the last man. And the last man happened. It is life in the early 21st century, in which we are nihilists. We focus entirely on our pleasure and comfort. We ignore the bigger questions by and large, not the audience of this event, of course, but the world is composed of many more people than you come across every day. Your particular circle of friends and acquaintances is a highly, highly selected one. It is not a fair representative sample of what's going on in human life out there. What's going on in human life out there is that people are doing everything they can to get distracted and not think too much. And they do that by eating crap, buying stuff they don't need, watching trash, fighting, and anesthetizing themselves with alcohol, drugs, television. This is the last man, a man that has lost contact with the roots of transcendence and with the thing that couches life in a context of meaning. So, yes, Nietzsche was right. He saw that about, I don't know, 40, 50 years before everybody realized that he was right. He warned us. We didn't heed the warning because had we done that, there would be no last man today. Nietzsche struggled a lot with himself because he probably had one of the most deep religious personalities that you could ever see in a human being. He had very, very strong religious dispositions, but he was a thinking human being, so he had to fight with that, which eventually drove him to madness, quite literally. Nietzsche did everything he could to replace the context of meaning that he had in his youth. He was a very religious person. When he was young, he was called um, the little priest. I think I don't know how to translate that. And the little priest, I think he was called. Jung was called Little Abraham. Father Abraham was Jung's nickname in school. Nietzsche's was the little priest. Um, and at some point, he had to discard the conventional view of God and transcendence because his reason told him this makes no sense. But he didn't have the depth of vision to understand that even the reason that tells you that God cannot be true, even that reason is blind. You have to dig a few layers deeper to understand in what way God is actually true without defying reason. To do that, you have to understand where the limits of reason lie, which is a very difficult exercise. It's a self-referential exercise, very difficult to do. And in Nietzsche's time, that was virtually impossible. I mean, we do it today. I did it, you did it, because we have 150 years of history between us and Nietzsche, and a completely different culture and access to much more information than Nietzsche did. Nietzsche was locked up in a very claustrophobic philosophical space, characteristics of his time. So what he did was he tried to derive a kind of secular religion, the Superman. He tried to restore transcendence by going through the eye of nihilism. Instead of running away from the storm, he thought he would find transcendence in the eye of the storm, sort of a forward escape. You escape your enemy's army by marching towards it as opposed to away from it. That was his heroic attempt in Zarathustra and with the Übermensch to find a kind of nihilistic, materialistic transcendence, to transcend the very limitations of nihilism. Can you do that by diving deep into nihilism? That's what the Superman was supposed to do. And that's the reason why Nietzsche never said what the Superman actually was. He never talked about the Superman, he talked around it. He was the harbinger of the Superman. He was the prophet that announced the coming of the Superman. But the Superman never came, so nobody knows what he was or what he was supposed to be. We can very strongly suspect that Nietzsche himself didn't know, because he never wrote it. He never said what the Superman was. He spent all his time saying what it was not and how he would come and stuff he would say, but he wouldn't say what he was. He would say all kinds of other things, or at least his mouthpiece, Zarathustra, would say all kinds of things. So I think if Nietzsche was alive today, knowing what we know today, he wouldn't have been the nihilistic materialist that he thought he was, which was contrary to the deepest intuitions he had, and that inner conflict eventually killed him.
All right. Thank you, Kesra.
You guys can call me Bernardo. And
can we? Oh, thank you so
and
much. Yes, Mr. Kastrup, Dr. Kastrup, Bernardo. Great, thank you. I'm gonna hand it over to Lucas, a friend of mine. He also has a question. I think he had a couple of questions. I think he had 4 or 3, but I'm just gonna let him ask 2 because there are a bunch of people in the queue, and there are more people who wants to ask questions. So, Lucas, I'm just gonna let you ask the first one. One sec. Lucas, you there? No? Okay. Then in the meantime, I'm just gonna ask my own, see what's happening with that. I'll just pick a question I have, and at least someone else asked it. I thought it was a very interesting question, and that was that how does analytic idealism explain phantom pain or phantom limb syndrome?
I don't think the explanation needs to be different from the one physicalism gives you. The physicalist explanation would be the data captured by the nerve terminations in your hand has to flow through your brain through a nerve network. And that nerve network goes through your entire arm. think of it as a telephone cable. It's transmitting data from the tip of your fingers to your brain, and that cable runs through your arm. If you cut off your arm in half and you lose half of it, half of that cable is still there. And its endings will now be exposed because you've cut it. And if you stimulate the endings of that cut cable from the perspective of your brain, it will be the same thing as if the signals had come from your fingers, because your brain doesn't see your fingers. It just sees what comes out of the cable. If something is coming out of that cable, your brain will misinterpret that as something coming out from a limb that is not there anymore. And that stimulation of this cut cable can be physical, but it can also be physiological, part of the healing process. Under idealism, this explanation holds. It's just that the metaphysical interpretation changes. The nerves that get cut are just the images of certain mental processes. A nerve cut in half is what an impaired mental process looks like. And it will lead to experiences that you used to associate with a hand, even though there is no hand there anymore. It's a sort of an echo of an experience that you used to have. It's now echoed in a different way, and you still have that experience, even though your hand is not there anymore. So analytic idealism doesn't replace scientific understanding. It replaces certain scientific fantasies, or invalidates certain scientific fantasies of a philosophical nature. It provides a different philosophical couching for scientific models, but it doesn't replace those models. What science has learned about the world and ourselves, with confidence, with repeated experiments, that stuff is still valid. We don't need to redo that stuff just because analytic idealism is true.
Okay. Let's see if Lucas's microphone works again. Lucas, can you unmute yourself? I don't think Lucas can unmute himself. Okay, then I'll just go to another question. Let me see. It's a question by Emmer Sib. I'm not sure how to pronounce his nickname. He asks, Bernardo, how does music fit into your worldview?
Well, whatever metaphysics you have, music is one of the deep mysteries we have staring us at the face. It is so common that we don't even think about it anymore, so we don't realize how much of a mystery it is. But why do certain rhythms and combinations of notes, in other words, certain arrangements of noises, why do certain arrangements of noise have this effect on us? Why does it make us want to move in sync with it? Why do we want to follow the patterns of noises and move along the noises? I mean, what the hell is going on here? Does that help you survive? Did this help you run away from tigers? Dancing your way away from the clutches of a tiger? I don't think so. Did it help you find food? Could you dance your way to the fruit tree? I don't think it did. Did it help you find a mate? Well, perhaps that's more like it, because we know that certain birds, if they do the right dance, they get to mate. But why do we enjoy that? Why don't we then just do the dance in order to get the mate? Why does it have this personal effect on us, even when we are not trying to mate? Why do I listen to Vivaldi when I'm not trying to have sex with my girlfriend? How is it that combination, that particular combination of noises, inspires me, opens transcendent vistas, reveals aspects of myself that I didn't know existed, makes me want to stick to it, makes me cry, makes me happy, makes me sad? How on earth is this possible? Whatever metaphysics you have, this is profound. I think Schopenhauer got the closest to the answer. And the answer was the following: the will Schopenhauer's word for universal mind, universal consciousness. The will has certain innate rhythms. The dance of existence is a dance of rhythms, a dance of rhythm and pace. It has a certain inner dynamics, just the way the skin of a drum vibrates when you hit it, producing, a note. Uh, uh, Reality is the product of something akin to musical vibrations. That's what it is in essence. Reality is an excitation of consciousness, a vibration of consciousness, which has certain inherent harmonics. You could call them psychological archetypes if you are a Jungian. Some inborn templates of behavior. In other words, some preferred harmonics, some preferred rhythms and notes that it resonates with because it is what it is and not something else. It has its own frequencies of resonance, so to say, and those are inborn. So the will has those inborn harmonies, so to say, in its behavior, in its expression or manifestation. And music for Schopenhauer was the closest representation of those innate rhythms of the will. Music was a representational echo of those mental archetypes of the will, of the universal mind. And that's why it has that effect on us, because it latches onto our own frequencies, our own harmonics, our own resonances, so to say, our own sympathetic resonances, and therefore we become attached to it through sympathetic resonance. It's a sort of a rhythmic mirror image. It's like putting a mirror in front of ourselves through rhythm and note, which tells us, look, this is what you are. You, as an entity, you exist by virtue of vibrating, between scare quotes, along these rhythms and harmonies that you hear now in this music. And that's why you latch onto it. That's why you like it. And I think Schopenhauer is right. I mean, empirically, different people like different styles of music because they are in different mental spaces. They are oscillating on different harmonics. So their harmonics latch to different styles of music. So somebody who is in a certain frame of mind, enforced by, we live in a very a society more cruel than we like to admit to ourselves, but some people understand that. I don't think anybody in this call would have direct experience with it. But if you live in oppression, in a society that portrays itself as being free, the oppression is double because you don't even get recognition for the oppression you are suffering. If you are in that state of mind because that's your daily life, you will resonate with music that gives expression to a reaction to that oppression. And you will listen to, I don't know, heavy metal, rap music. Heavy metal, no. It's a different vibe. I used to like heavy metal a lot in my younger years, and I didn't feel oppressed. But well, you know what I mean. You know what I'm trying to say. You will like the music that resonates with the note in which you are vibrating. In other words, that will resonate with the state of your mind at a certain point in time. And your music taste will vary, will change, because you'll be resonating according to other archetypes of the universal mind. And therefore, you resonate with other music that represent or echo those different archetypes or those different harmonics.
I like that answer, Bernardo. I tend to change my music every year, so it's. I feel what you're saying. In the meantime, I'm going to ask a question from Lucas. There was something with his microphone, so I have the questions right in front of me, so I'm just going to read them verbatim. He asks two questions. The first one is, what are your thoughts on the relationship between matter and the speed of light? And how does this relate to consciousness? And he has between parentheses mind at large. And the second question is, why is mind at large excited at all? And could we develop a science of the excitation of mind at large? Could we interfere? So I'll just ask the first one again. What are your thoughts on the relationships between matter and the speed of light, and how does that relate to consciousness or mind at large?
Again, I wouldn't try to replace Einstein's reasoning for why the speed of light in the vacuum is a universal constant, or the universal constant. There are others, but it's the one that we talk about most often. It is very difficult to grasp Einstein's thought experiments that have led him to this conclusion that the speed of light in a vacuum is not dependent on the speed of the observer. Because speed is always dependent on a reference point. You know, if you're inside the train is going at 100 kilometers an hour with respect to the pole outside, or the car parked outside, but with respect to you inside, it's not moving at any speed. The speed is zero. So speed is relative by definition, except the speed of light in a vacuum. It is not relative. It is an absolute, regardless of where the reference point is or how it's moving. It doesn't matter. Now, Einstein had a series of thought experiments that led to this conclusion. He imagined himself riding the wavefront of light, and what would he perceive? How would he perceive the world if he were moving at the speed of light, of riding the wavefront of a light wave? I don't think I can make sense of that in this call right now, because I still struggle with it now and then. Every now and then I have to go back and sort of reread it and think about it again, and oh yeah, okay, I understand it now again. But I wouldn't replace that. You see, the physical world is indeed just the dashboard of the airplane. It is not the real world outside. The real world outside is not physical. And the airplane doesn't have a transparent windshield. It doesn't have any windows at all. It only has the dashboard. This is all true. But you have to keep in mind that we are born and live our entire lives inside the airplane. We never get to go out and experience the world as it is in itself. Our only means to interact with the world is the dashboard from birth. So our entire way of thinking and our language have evolved around the paradigm of the dashboard, the dimensions and parameters of the dashboard. We speak dashboard. We don't speak reality, we speak dashboard, if you know what I mean. And it's not necessary to transcend that, to throw our language and our conceptual armor away and try to speak reality as opposed to dashboard, because it will be an exercise in more or less loose imagination. So physics, although it is fundamentally a science of the dashboard and not a science of the real world outside, it is the best we have. It is the language we have. All experimental results come to us through the dashboard because we need to perceive the output of the instrumentation, of the measurement apparatuses. So that's the language we speak. And that's the conceptual dictionary we use in our reasoning. And I think it's okay so long as we keep in mind that it is the dashboard, so we don't start deriving the wrong implications from unexamined metaphysical assumptions, such as, well, if I am born in the dashboard and the dashboard is all I have, when I die and I don't have the dashboard anymore, then I'm dead. Then there is no consciousness anymore. No. You are born into the airplane. When you die, you leave the airplane, but you're back to the world. So yes, these things you have to keep in mind, not to derive the wrong implications from knee-jerk philosophical assumptions. But beyond that, when we are talking science, it's perfectly okay to speak the language of the dashboard, to speak dashboard, because that's all we have. We are born in that airplane. Our language developed on that basis. So it's okay to talk about the speed of light. Now, I know that others, have made different thought experiments. And for instance, forgot his name, Peter, I forgot his name. He's a physicist, but became sort of a meditation guy in more recent years. But he says, okay, according to relativity, from the point of view of the photon, a particle of light, there is no time, because the photon moves at the speed of light, and at the speed of light, time doesn't pass. So fantastic, and from the point of view of photon, there is no time, and therefore there is no space. It's space-time. If it takes you no time to go from A to B, then you are at both A and B right now. It takes no time to go from one to the other. So from the point of view of the photon, the photon lives in eternity, lives outside space-time, because from the point of view of the photon, there is no time and there is no space. Wow, does that have some spiritual implications? I don't think that's necessarily the case at all. Personally, I don't think it has. It may sound very wow, but the photon is a theoretical entity. Photons are not things with standalone existence. Photons are the pixels of the screen of perception. A photon is a convenient fiction. You might say, well, but I can measure one photon hitting a photoelectric sensor if I use enough photomultipliers and all that good stuff. True, but all of this is intermediated by the language of the dashboard. So you're still speaking dashboard, not reality. So to say that from the point of view of the photon, there is no time and space, is like saying from the point of view of the movement of that dial on the dashboard, nothing's happening. Yeah, great. Is there a profound implication to that? I don't think so. You're still talking about something happening on a little dial. You are not talking about the real world outside. So yeah, I don't get too hot about the thought that photons no time passes. Yeah, I'm great. That's what theory says. It's internally consistent, but I don't make too much of it from a fantastic metaphysical perspective. No, I don't do that.
Thank you. It was a long answer, but let me see. We have on stage another question from the audience. Oh, and by the way, when I said long answer, I love it. By the way, don't worry.
I'll try to shorten it because there are so many questions, and
yeah,
I
that's
can't
the thing.
Here all night.
I think we have 100 questions, and we like you to answer each and every one of them, obviously.
I'll try to be quicker.
Okay, great. So I'm going to pass it over to Tepa, and well, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly fine.
Okay, so my question is about these two metaphors that I have heard Bernardo mention. The one of them is the dashboard that he spoke about earlier, and the other is the wave and the ocean analogy, or the wave and the water analogy. So in the dashboard analogy, the dials, everything we experience is the dials, and we have no direct path or direct way to experience what is outside of the dashboard of dials. But in the wave and the ocean analogy, it is not so, because the water exists in the wave is water, and the ocean is water. So if what we perceive now is only water, then in this analogy, we have direct access to water. So how do we reconcile the difference or the apparent contradiction between these two metaphors?
The dashboard is made of consciousness. The dashboard is a content of consciousness. It's not separate or different from consciousness. It's a content of it. It's a particular configuration of consciousness that leads to experiences with particular qualities. Now, those qualities are not the same qualities that are experienced from the point of view of mind at large, what's going on outside the plane. there is a translation there, which we call the dashboard. But the dashboard is made of consciousness. The airplane is made of consciousness. The occupants are made of consciousness. The world outside is made of consciousness. These are all configurations and particular patterns of excitations of consciousness in consciousness. It's all just the ocean.
Just a follow-up question about that.
Yeah, sure, go ahead. It's fine. You can ask a follow-up question.
So if I understood correctly, the patterns, one of these patterns is the individuation, like me or you, but then outside of this individual pattern, the ocean exists, or the consciousness exists as some kind of patterns also outside of this individuation.
Sure.
So the consciousness itself is the same, outside or inside is exactly the same, because it's only consciousness outside and inside. So does that consciousness, would you say it exists does it have a nature in itself that does not appear as a pattern, either inside or outside?
I think consciousness is that whose excitations or movements or vibrations are what we call experiences. And that's how we can explain complexity, even though there is only one thing going on at all times. There is only one consciousness. But that one consciousness can be excited in infinite different ways, infinite different patterns, and it can fold and contort itself into an infinity of different topologies as well. Now, what is that which gets excited? In other words, what is the essence of consciousness itself? It is subjectivity. It is the potential to experience. If you're trying to look for a way to turn that into a thing, a substance of some sort, then you are already automatically contradicting the notion that it is consciousness, that it is the subject and not an object. Objects are what we call objects are certain patterns of excitation of the thing that gets excited. But the thing that gets excited isn't even a thing. It isn't a pattern of its own excitations. It isn't a particular topology that it happens to take. It is the thing that takes on a topology. It is the thing that gets excited. And what is that thing? Well, it's the subject. It's not an object. It is pure subjectivity, the raw potential to experience. And I don't know whether this was part of your question, but somebody else asked another question. I forgot to answer this part. Why does that thing get excited? Well, because it is its nature to self-excite. I know these answers may feel unsatisfactory or dissatisfactory, because we tend to regard explanation as making sense of one thing in terms of another. If you don't reduce one thing to another, if you don't explain it in terms of something else, then you didn't explain. But of course, you can't keep on playing this game forever. You can't explain one thing in terms of another forever. Because if you do, then you eventually go back to where you started, and you will be entertaining circular reasoning. In other words, you'll be explaining nothing. You'll be saying, well, B is a product of A and A is a product of B. Well, congratulations. Have you said anything? No, nothing. If you want to avoid that, at some point you have to stop this chain of reduction. You have to stop trying to explain one thing in terms of another and saying that, okay, at this point, we have hit rock bottom. At this point, this is just what is. It's just what exists. And what exists is the subject. The answer is kind of obvious if we are not prejudiced by culture. But what exists is the subject. And the subject has the inherent disposition to excite itself, to wind itself up. Why does it have that? Because it is what it is. And we can't give another answer. Even if we could, it means that we would be just postponing the point where we would be uncomfortable again and not being able to give another answer again. And if you want to avoid that, then you have to engage into the fallacy of circular reasoning. So we will never have the answer of what is consciousness in relation to something that isn't consciousness? Because there isn't anything that isn't consciousness. So consciousness will always have this cosmic primordial itch. It cannot tell itself in a satisfactory way what it is, because it is the thing that is trying to produce the answer. It doesn't have an external reference to say, well, I am gray because that thing is white, I'm not quite like that. That thing is black, I am not quite like that. Therefore, I am gray. And then you're happy. But from the point of view of consciousness, there is no black and there is no white, because there is nothing that isn't it. There is nothing outside of itself. So all you can do is to reduce the particular patterns of excitation and the particular topological contortions of consciousness to consciousness, and understand that there is nothing else but consciousness, because only then you derive the correct implications about the meaning of life, what happens when you die, all that good stuff that is important for us. But you cannot go further. You cannot scratch the cosmic itch of, but what am I actually? No, sorry, we will itch forever.
Yeah, this is one of the points that I thought were very beautiful in one of your books. And it's a bit frustrating, but it's also intuitive and beautiful in that you cannot explain consciousness in terms of anything else, because there isn't anything else outside of consciousness, because there is no outside of consciousness. And it's
Yet we know it by acquaintance, and we know what it is to be a subject. And if you
that's all we
meditate,
know.
then you can exactly. But beyond that, if you know how to meditate and you know how to clear your mind, then you also know what it is to be a pure subject. And that is the knowledge of what consciousness is. You cannot word it, you cannot conceptualize it, but you can know it by direct acquaintance, because you are it.
I have a question tangentially related to this. So you said that core subjectivity may be a base excitation, or what Hindus call a drone, right?
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean that consciousness in of itself, when it is not excited, it has no qualia, has no subjective experience?
I don't know how much of an artifact of a conceptual model this may be, so we have to be careful with continuing to extract implications from a conceptual model, because at some point the model gives up and it's no longer reliable to indicate implications. So I think your question, it lies right on the border of what I am comfortable to extract from the model. I'm not quite sure that the model is robust enough to give us a reliable answer here. But the model is that particular qualities of experience are particular patterns of excitation of consciousness. So you imagine consciousness as a sort of hyperdimensional membrane, and it can get excited like the skin of a drum can get excited, and there can be infinite patterns of excitation. Now, experiences are these patterns of excitation. And consciousness is the thing that gets excited in order to have experiences, which of course raises the question you were alluding to. If the thing is not excited at all, is there anything it is like to be, or to be consciousness? And the model would say, no, then experience ceases, because experience is an excitation. If there is no excitation, then consciousness remains as the potential for experience, but not as experience. The thing whose excitations are experiences, that thing is still there. And in a sense, nothing ceased to exist, because what are excitations but the thing excited? There is nothing more to excitations but the thing excited. There is nothing more to a vibrating guitar string than the string. If the string is not vibrating, you don't have a note, but the string is still there. And if you pluck it, you have a note, and it's the same string, and there is still nothing but the string. So nothing is lost, precisely nothing is lost, but there is no experience, and there is nothing, because nothing is experience. So there isn't even time. There isn't even darkness. there's nothing. And yet everything is still there in potential. Now, meditators and mystics throughout history have said there is a state of consciousness that they call pure awareness, consciousness devoid of experiences. How do we reconcile that with this model in which every experience is an excitation of consciousness? Well, by saying that consciousness cannot become fully unexcited. There is always a base note. People with a background in electronics engineering or telecommunications, there is always a carrier wave, even when the wave is not being modulated. A modulation is an excitation that you add to a carrier wave, which itself is an excitation. And that's how radio communications, broadcast television, internet, Wi-Fi, that's how all this stuff gets done. When you hear that my Wi-Fi signal is at 2.4 gigahertz, that's the carrier wave. It's just a base excitation. But the data you receive via Wi-Fi are other excitations that are added to that base, that are added to the 2.5 gigahertz. So you could think of ordinary experiences as this data that you add to it, as these other excitations that you pile up on top of the carrier wave. But the carrier wave is always there. It's the drone of Hindu music. It's the base note. Consciousness is never at complete rest. It can stop modulating its carrier wave, but it always has the carrier wave. And because it's an excitation, there is something it is like to be in that state of consciousness with the pure, unmodulated carrier wave. And that's what the mystics refer to as the void or pure awareness. It's when you are not modulating the carrier wave, but you still have the carrier wave. So this is a way to reconcile a conceptual model with reported first-person experience, which I like enough to discuss and to share. But it is on the edge of reliability of a conceptual model. And we have to keep this in mind, because to think that, our conceptual reasoning, which is about 30,000 years old, in other words, it was born yesterday. It's not even a kid yet. It's an infant. It didn't even open its eyes yet. To think that it's already capable enough to grasp and make sense of every salient aspect of reality is preposterous. It's not only arrogant, it's beyond arrogant. It's nonsensical, it's ridiculous. So not everything that is true and relevant can be captured in a conceptual model. And that's why we have to be careful, even with analytic idealism or any other conceptual model, M theory, loop quantum gravity, and cosmos cycling, whatever you want, whatever conceptual model you have to stay alert to the fact that when you push that model too far, it may produce wrong outputs. It may lead you to wrong implications. I think the idea of the carrier wave, the drone, is valid, but if I communicate it, I like to add this grain of salt.
Is it coherent to say that core subjectivity is consciousness unexcited? Would that be a valid model as well?
Yeah, I think it's coherent to say that, yeah. I think that's what is meant. That's what Itay Shani meant when he came up with the idea of core subjectivity. It's precisely what he meant, I think. Because Itay, he defines core subjectivity as the dative of experience, as that to which experience is given. And that's exactly the idea of modulation. Core subjectivity is the carrier wave, that which receives the modulating frequencies on it, that to which the modulating frequencies are given.
That seems reasonable. So I have a question from Dream Dancer. He says, you've talked in the past about how you've come to the same monistic idealist conclusions that the Vedic sages who composed the Upanishads have, but that in their case it was via direct experience as opposed to via reasoning and logic in yours. So why don't you seem to also value their insights on the existence of reincarnation and the hierarchy of dissociation, or Atman? if they've gotten it right before and have had actual direct experience of what you come to through reasoning.
I don't discount those insights at all. I think the first person experience of what we call reincarnation exists, and it's true and it's valid, but we construe something out of it that may not be true. Under analytic idealism, your life's memories don't disappear when you die. They are just liberated from the confines of a dissociative boundary. They become available to the rest of the universe, to the mind of the universe at large, so to say. So when another dissociative alter forms later on, it's entirely coherent to imagine that it then, in the process of its formation, encompasses some of those memories that are now released. Those memories get captured by another alter, and those are then the memories of reincarnation. Now, that doesn't mean that a personal agent has left a material body like a form of ethereal cloud and then entered another body and as a sort of an occupier, as a tenant, and that individual agency remained the same throughout this process. That's what we make of reincarnation, at least in the Western model of reincarnation. There is a thing, an individual thing, that moves from body to body, like a tenant moves from flat to flat. I think that is a limiting metaphor, and it leads to problems because it's dualistic as well. And we know that dualism has some fundamental problems. But the same phenomenology, the same first person experience can be accounted for under analytic idealism, which is monist. Memories are not lost. I mean, when you wake up from a dream in the morning, your dream avatar is dead. That dissociative process that separated the dream avatar from the mind that creates the rest of the dream, that dissociation ends. You wake up and you remember it was your mind doing the whole thing, not only the avatar, but everything else in the dream. So your dream avatar is dead in the analytic idealist sense. It's toast, it's gone. But you remember the dream, at least potentially. You remember the dream and you don't cry for the loss of your dream avatar because you know nothing was actually lost. It was just a change in the configuration of the same consciousness that was going on in the dream and still going on outside the dream. You just remember that something else was happening that you didn't know during the dream, but nothing's lost. Not the subjectivity, the core subjectivity, and not the memories either. You remember the dream. So I think if we die, we remember who we were. We will just have a different feeling for what we actually are.
So sorry to interrupt, but I think Dream Dancer is asking, why don't you favor a model of hierarchy of dissociation over that model that you propose when the Hindus and other Eastern faiths seem to favor that kind of model? I don't think it would necessarily be dualistic, because there may be aspects of our dissociated alter that we can't pick up on, like you alluded to before.
That's correct. You can have a hierarchy of dissociation and stick to monism, and then there would still be some literal form of reincarnation possible. So the end of your human dissociation would make you fall back into a higher hierarchy of dissociation in which some degree of individuality is preserved, and then that thing could spawn from within itself another lower level dissociation, which then would be the reincarnation of the original entity. This is coherent. Why do I not defend this? Because I don't know how to defend it on objective grounds. I am very happy to follow the sages to give a sort of objective substantiation to the things they put forward from a first person subjective perspective. But I can't blindly follow the sages because otherwise I will undo my work. I will violate the epistemic principles I need to espouse in order to be taken seriously by the culture of our times today, given the set of epistemic values that we take seriously today. Yes, that's a transitory thing. It's just the assumptions we happen to like at this point in history. They are not the same that we liked 1,000 years ago. They are bound not to be the same that we'll take seriously 1,000 years from now. but they are the ones we take seriously today. So if you want to be effective in practice in the early 21st century, Western-dominated world civilization, you have to espouse those relatively arbitrary epistemic values. So if I cannot defend a position based on objective reasoning and empirical evidence, then I will not do so, even if I may or may not harbor an internal suspicion that there is more to the story than what I'm saying.
I think that's completely appropriate for your position. I'll move the question to Ted W.
Ted W, are you there? Are you listening? Okay. I don't think, okay. Well, Robin, can you just pick another question?
Sure. I guess I'll
Thanks.
ask one of mine then. So, what do you think of the people who say that the many worlds interpretation is the most parsimonious because it postulates only one kind of thing?
I think they mistake epistemic parsimony for ontic parsimony. The parsimony argument for the many worlds interpretation is that I don't agree with it, but the claim is that it is the interpretation that follows most simply from Schrödinger's equation. Because quantum mechanics is based on two fundamental processes. One is linear and the other one is nonlinear. One is deterministic and the other one is not. The linear deterministic process is the evolution of the wave function, or Schrödinger's equation, which determines an envelope of probabilities for things that may or may not happen. It attaches a probability number for what may happen in nature. And the evolution of that wave function is the evolution of these probability numbers, is the chance that certain things will or will not happen at different points in time. That is deterministic and linear. We have a good grasp of that. But of course, it only talks about probabilities. It says nothing about what actually happens. So what determines what actually happens? We don't know. We refer to it as wave function collapse. I don't think there is literal wave function collapse at all, but that's how it's presented. I lost the train of my thought because I lost your question. Can you quickly remind me what was your questioning?
Yeah, it was about some people like Sean Carroll argue that.
The many worlds interpretation. So the claim of the many worlds interpretation is that you get rid of this nonlinear process, the wave function collapse. You get rid of it by just saying there is no collapse. Everything that can possibly happen will happen in a parallel universe. Now, does the claim have some validity? I mean, the people who put it forward are not complete idiots. So what they latch into is epistemic parsimony. It's the idea that all I know for sure, and I have a good grasp of, is Schrödinger's equation, is the evolution of the wave function. Everything else is a sort of an add-on because I don't have a clear grasp of what's going on when it comes to collapse. I don't know what's actually happening when probabilities translate into actualities. It's shaky ground epistemically. I don't know how or why that happens. So if I get rid of that, then I am, epistemically speaking, parsimonious because I'm focusing on what I do know. Now, of course, the implication of this epistemic parsimony is the greatest departure from ontic parsimony that you could possibly conceive of. You're basically saying that everything that can possibly happen does happen. So you end up needing to postulate that there are gazillions of new real physical universes as big as this one popping into existence out of nothing for no reason every infinitesimal fraction of a second. I mean, nothing is less parsimonious than this when it comes to existence, to things that actually exist. You're basically postulating that everything exists. Everything that can be allowed to exist according to the loose boundaries of the wave function actually exists. That's what you're saying. So it's incredibly not parsimonious as far as existence are concerned. But the claim is, well, it's epistemic parsimonious because I focus on only the thing I know for sure. But my question to you would be, what does reality care about what you know for sure and what you don't? Reality is not determined by what we know. Reality is what it is. It doesn't care what we think we know, what we think we don't know, what we think we are sure of or not. It doesn't give a bloody damn about our monkey thoughts. Reality just is. So to adopt epistemic parsimony to guide your understanding of reality is an extraordinary fallacy because it's attributing magical powers to the human mind. It's saying nature will comply to the limitations of my understanding. I mean, this is ridiculous. We are monkeys running around a planet that is part of an average solar system in a typical galaxy. You see? So, yeah, the point is epistemic parsimony, but it's a ridiculous point. That's the summary of my answer.
Okay, I have a quick question, and then I'll try to get Ted to ask you a question. I think he said that you'll have a chat with Eben Alexander. Is that gonna happen?
We never had a public chat, no.
No, I think he said that on Twitter that you're down for a chat with him, and he replied to you or something of the sort.
I would chat to Eben anytime. Yeah, sure.
Cool.
It wouldn't be a debate in the sense that you wouldn't see each other. We wouldn't see us fight each other. So it's an interesting from that perspective. It's like, I mean, recently I finally had a recorded chat with Rupert Spira after years of non-recorded chats, personal chats, because we figured who would want to watch us talk to each other? We'll not disagree, you know. It's not the UFC that you're going to see. It's not the intellectual UFC you would get between, I don't know, me and Sam Harris. And people like bloody battles, you know. I understand it. I like them too. I watch the UFC, by the way. So this stuff doesn't happen because we tend to think that people wouldn't watch, but people told us, me and Rupert, that they would love to watch it. So we recorded one recently. I don't know whether it's made public already. There was a BBC journalist that facilitated it for us. But if it's not available now, I don't know whether it will be freely available either. It's Rupert's team that is organizing that. But we did that. Would I do that with Eben? Sure. I would enjoy talking to Eben. And if you guys think it should be recorded and made public, I have no protest against that.
So, Ted, can you speak right now?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can.
Yeah, you can hear me. I'm actually a former Sam Harris listener, so that would be interesting to hear the debate. But then again, maybe not. But my question is just: I was wondering, Bernardo, whether what you think of Spinoza, because he had a thoroughgoing monism that seemed maybe compatible with analytic idealism.
Well, Spinoza is a compatriot. I relate to him even more than I think the average Dutch person relates to him, because Spinoza had an Iberian background, and I'm half Iberian. Iberian, Celt, I don't know, well, you know, new genetics are changing the names of that. I am told by genetic tests that I'm half Iberian, but the cloud goes all the way into Wales and Ireland, France, and I'm like, what the hell? I couldn't have come from all those places. But that's how it's sort of, the categories are carved out nowadays. So I share that with Spinoza. He was an Iberian man, and his family came to the Netherlands running away from persecution. You know, when the North Africans, the Moors, Muslims controlled the Iberian Peninsula, the Jews were safe. I mean, it's funny for the world today, right? That the Arabs and the Jews want to sort of slit each other's throats. Back in the day, the Muslims were the ones protecting the Jews because the Christians wanted the heads of the Jews. But then the Moors were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula by the Christian armies, and the Jewish people started having a harder life. So Spinoza's family moved to Amsterdam because the Dutch people are commerce people. And if you are traders, if you're commerce people, you want to be on good terms with everyone. Otherwise, you don't survive, you know. So they came to Amsterdam, and that's where Spinoza grew up and developed his philosophy. He was excommunicated from the Jewish faith as well. So I relate to him a lot. I know he's drastically misunderstood on one particular point. People say that Spinoza's God was identical with material nature. Spinoza himself tried to dismiss this misinterpretation, to combat this misinterpretation in his lifetime before the publication of his most defining book, The Ethics. So before even the Ethics were out, the Ethics were published posthumously, he was already preempting this kind of attack in a letter he wrote to his friend Oldenburg. I think 1675. I think November or December 1675. You can look up that letter. It's written in Latin, but you can look it up if you want. And he says, no, for me, God is that which is represented in the material world. It's that which the material world is an image of, a dashboard representation of. So in that sense, he was saying the same thing that I and others are saying today. The difference is that for Spinoza, consciousness, or at least human consciousness, which was the only example he had in his time, academia hadn't extrapolated consciousness to other states and other incarnations, if you will. Consciousness or mind was a human thing in the early days of the Enlightenment, so that was Spinoza's time. So human consciousness for him was not primary. What he put forward is that the primary thing, the ontological primitive, the primary substance, between quotes, substance in the Greek sense of ousia, what the Greeks meant by ousia, which basically means that which is irreducible, that which you cannot explain in terms of anything else. For him, the ousia was God. So God had its own substance, its own ousia, its own primary stuff. And that primary stuff would present itself in different forms. It would present itself in a material form. It would present itself in a human mental or consciousness form, and would present itself in countless other forms as well. But of course, these two are the ones we are familiar with. So strictly speaking, and Spinoza was quite clear. I mean, he wrote using Euclidean form as if he were writing mathematical theorems and deriving lemmas and implications and all that. His philosophy, strictly speaking, was multi-aspect monism, under which both matter and human consciousness were aspects of a third, deeper thing, namely God stuff, divine ousia. So not quite analytic idealism. But I think if Spinoza came back to life and we would go together to have a beer along the canals of Amsterdam, I think you would find that what I call phenomenal consciousness, he would understand that to not be human minds. He would understand that to not be a dissociated form of consciousness that folds in on itself in order to give rise to metacognition or self-reflection or self-awareness. And he would say, actually, now that I understood what you mean by phenomenal consciousness, Bernardo, I think that's more or less what I meant by God, by divine ousia. In other words, phenomenal consciousness, core subjectivity. So I like to entertain this fantasy. But if you ask me, was Spinoza an analytic idealism, I would have no objective reasons to say that. I would have to tell you he was a multi-aspect monist
Thank you very much. That's great.
The misrepresentation of Spinoza reminds me of the people who say that the collective unconscious is biological.
Yeah, there are well-known, respected Jungian scholars, tempted to say the name, but I shall refrain, who still maintain this ridiculous notion that the collective unconscious is a genetic inheritance. I mean, yes, it makes Jungian psychology more amenable to modern prejudices, but you don't need to read the entire corpus of Jung's work to realize that that's not at all what he meant. It's completely incompatible with a lot of things he said. So we know for certain that for Jung, the collective unconscious was not just a genetic inheritance. It is something that underlies both us and the inanimate world as well, and that's why we can speak of synchronicities. So yeah, I don't know what Anthony Stevens was thinking when he put that in a bloody academic book. I don't know.
All right. I'm going to take it over from here for a couple of questions. Well, I have something to say. There's not a question. You guys just mentioned, or Bernardo, you just mentioned willing to speak with people or wondering if people will be interested in, well, listening to talks where people just agree with each other for 2 hours. And I'm perfectly fine with that. I don't need to see you debate everyone or destroy materialists. I love to watch it. It makes me laugh and it puts me in a good mood to see you put these people in the ground, let's say. But I love to see you talk with people where you just simply disagree and build on each other. I mean, I've seen it happen with Vervaeke. There was some disagreements in the first, or at least misunderstandings would be the better word, misinterpretations, not necessarily disagreements. But in the second half of the talk, you guys seem to agree in a lot of parts. And I haven't seen the talk with Spira, but yeah, you would do us a pleasure. I would hope to see a talk between you and Joshua Bach once. I heard you guys have some trouble, or at least you were willing to speak to him. But do you think it's going to happen?
No, I accept it. Look, there are people out there who would love to organize, big time debates involving me. I know attempts have been made, but a lot of people don't accept to debate me. Some people do. Christoph Koch, arguably the world's most preeminent neuroscientist, accepted to do it in December last year. It was great. It was very civilized, very content rich. I debated Sam Harris's wife once.
Yeah, but what I mean is, I prefer if you, well, personally, I prefer to see more talks where you do not debate people, but just, well, it may sound boring, but we just agree with each other, let's say, for 2 or 3 hours. It'll be cool too.
Some people who disagree with me will not debate me, which is a pity. Some of them I have profound respect for. Carlo Rovelli is one. We have had our conversations, not debates, not recorded, not in public. We have had exchanges which were productive, very civilized. I would love to debate him in public, but he didn't want to do that when it was proposed. The stuff you saw me write about Sabine Hossenfelder earlier today was stuff I wanted to debate with her, to discuss, to talk live in a public debate. Attempts were made to make that happen, that she was not available to do that. Joshua Bach, I didn't even know he was a thing. He used to follow me years ago. He used to come to my website, to my forum. We engaged in a month-long intense message exchange, post exchange. I used to participate in a public forum back in the day. Today it's impossible for me to do that. Ended in a disagreement. At some point he went ballistic. He started just, harassing me. So I had to ban the guy, and I thought, it's just a professor. Apparently he's a thing now, as some kind of AI evangelizer. I don't have much respect for him. And I don't mean that I disrespect him, but it's just that, I don't care much either way. But I know that some people have tried to organize a debate between me and him and asked me if I would be willing. And I said, well, I don't think this is particularly an interesting debate, but I would be willing to do that. But apparently he was not. I mean, Massimo Pigliucci is very happy to attack me through, half-baked essays every now and then, but he will not debate me.
Well, it's a shame that people want to attack you, and that's what I mean. I would love to see another debate, a conversation. More speaking of, this is one of my questions. Ian McGilchrist is also with the Essentia Foundation. He's an author there, right? And so,
he's a member of our advisory board.
Can I safely assume you are familiar with his work?
Yeah.
Okay. So
yeah, I'm always careful because when I say I'm familiar with someone's work, it means that I probably can quote passages of specific pages. I'm not that familiar with Ian's work, but I'm roughly familiar with the general lines. Yeah.
Okay, so if I say it's about the hemispheric differences in our brain, and
that's the previous work. Yeah, I'm quite familiar with that. It's somewhere here on my.
Yeah, no, I'm not talking about his latest. Have you read his latest book, The Matter with Things?
Yeah.
I'm still. It's enormous. Okay, so it relates to his first book, and so you've read it. And my question is, because I was wondering this, how does it fit into analytic idealism? And because you mention consciousness and meta consciousness, and where meta consciousness is consciousness about itself, and consciousness proper is just, well, mind at large, let's say, just consciousness as an ontological primitive. But Ian's work, or at least his first book, refers to two predispositions to the world, the left hemispheric one, which is analytical. Well, I find it hard to describe his theory without reducing it to misunderstandings, but it almost sounds like analytic idealism is a contradiction in terms. Let's say you have idealism, which is kind of the right brain view of the world, which sees everything as one, and then you have the analytic view of the world, which sees everything built up from parts. This is just something that pops into my mind. Is there some? How do these ideas fit into your worldview?
What Ian calls the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere cannot be literalized. It doesn't mean it literally on this side of your brain and that side of your brain. We know now that things don't work quite like that, that functional specialization is more or less fluidic in the brain. What is on the left side may go to the right and the other way around. Things are more or less distributed. So what he's talking about is certain modes of being that we roughly, on average, associate with the left hemisphere, and other modes of being or modes of apprehending the world and the self that are, on average, more or less correlated with the right hemisphere. And so the right mode is holistic, it is alive, it is spontaneous. The left one, instead of looking at the forest, looks at the trees. It is dissecting, it is analytical, and it's sharp and focused. So with the right, you have the breadth. With the left, you have the focus and the detail. I don't think they are incompatible. I think they are complementary, and I think that's why we have both. I think that's why we evolved this way. If historically idealism in its many forms has mostly been derived from the sort of view of the forest mode of the right hemisphere, a sort of direct, lived acquaintance with the truth, that overview, that the gestalt understanding of, oh, this is what's happening, and you don't only conceptualize it, you live it, you come in contact with it by acquaintance. That's the right mode, and historically that has been the origin of most idealist formulations, the origin and motivation. But I don't think that means that you cannot arrive at the same place from the dissecting, analytic, focused approach of the left hemisphere. I don't think it's even difficult. It's just that culturally we have come to associate analytic reasoning with the bullshit of materialism. which is a phenomenal psychosocial development in Western culture. It's fairly recent. It began in the Enlightenment. But back in the Enlightenment, people were still aware that it was bullshit and it was just a political tool. I mean, Denis Diderot, one of the authors of La Encyclopédie, you could argue that's the founding document of the Enlightenment, right? He's on record saying, well, we know that materialism doesn't quite work, but we need to use it against the church. Otherwise, we are going to be burned at the stake. So they knew what and why they were doing it, espousing materialism at the time, because it was their way to say, Mrs. Church, you have the mind. You think the mind is everything. You have it. We are not going to get in there. Mind, psyche also means soul. So the words mind and soul in Latin or in Greek are the same, psyche. So the church has the soul, the mind, the consciousness. And we do this thing with matter, which is a separate thing. And the church, of course, would laugh and say, the mind is everything. But if you want to play around in your sandbox with your delusions, we don't mind. We are not going to burn you at the stake like we did with Bruno. And everybody was happy. And people knew at the time, scientists knew that that's what they were doing. But at some point, halfway through the 19th century, we forgot. When Nietzsche declared the death of God, that was the point when fluid compensation, which is a well-known psychological phenomenon, motivated the intellectual elite to differentiate itself, to portray themselves as the tough guys who stare, the hard facts in the face and say, when we die, we die. We have the courage and the bravery to admit to this. And the populace, they can have their God. They can have the wish-fulfilling relationship with imaginary entities. We are better. And of course, that brings meaning to life. Self-aggrandizement and differentiation makes you feel good. And the elite did that, and it's still doing it. The only problem is that the reasoning and the evidence behind that is contradictory with the position that is supposed to be substantiated by the reasoning and the evidence. In other words, the whole thing is a shit show. It's an intellectual shit show, but it's stuck and acquired cultural momentum. And when it acquires cultural momentum, the plausibility of a position gets manufactured. Plausibility can be manufactured culturally. You can say something that in one culture sounds like preposterous, and in another, people say, oh, no, this is so reasonable, it's probably true. This is manufactured stuff. A culture manufactures our sense of plausibility. And it has manufactured the sense that materialism is plausible.
Thank you. I'm just going to go to another question, just to get as many questions as possible. Sean asks, does analytic idealism have anything to say metaphysically about the concept of enlightenment as seen by Eastern philosophies?
Enlightenment is probably the first person experience of a significant weakening of the dissociative boundary of an alter without completely dissolving that boundary, because the dissolution of the boundary is death. So how far can you go in weakening that boundary, making it porous and permeable without compromising its viability? In other words, without dying. If you can do that, then the first person experience of the result probably would be what we call enlightenment.
Okay, that's fairly quick. Cool. Then I'm gonna ask you one more question. You're so fast, and then I'm gonna give you back to my co-host. And my question again is, who's your favorite contemporary philosopher, intellectual thinker, or personality? It's just someone who's alive right now, and you have lots of respect for.
Oh, I have a great relationship with the dead, not with the living. I could answer that question instantly if you asked me about any century before the 21st.
Yeah. No, they have to be alive.
Today.
No. They have to be still. Yeah. They have to have a heartbeat at least.
Look, I don't want to come across as putting him in too great a height, because I disagree with a whole bunch of things he says. But nobody, not even he himself, can take away from David Chalmers the framing of what we now know as the hard problem of consciousness that reignited discussions about consciousness in intellectual circles in Western civilization. He himself, I know him personally, he says, oh, come on, I did nothing. Everybody knew that stuff. I just chose some words and I summarized it in a conference somewhere in New Mexico in 1994. So he himself sort of puts the formulation of the hard problem down because he is right. People already knew it. It was going by a different name. It was called the explanatory gap in the 80s. And allegedly, the key insight was published first in a paper published in 1974 called What is it like to be a bat? Which made clear the differentiation between mental function and experience. Because we can replicate the functions of a bat, we can create radar, all kinds of things, but what is it like to be a bat? That's what's missing. And so allegedly, strictly speaking, the key moment happened 20 years before Dave gave that fateful talk in New Mexico or Arizona, I forgot where it was. But framing a problem, even if the problem is already known, framing it in just the right way, like he did, is halfway to the solution.
Okay,
and
so
nobody can take that away from him, not even himself. And the framing of the problem, which was perfect, I'm not shy away from using this word. It was a perfect framing, was the following. There is nothing about physical parameters in terms of which we could deduce the qualities of experience. One phrase, only a few words, and this is it. That's the jewel. Not even Dave Chalmers can rob that from himself. He tries, but not even him can do that.
Thank you, Bernardo. Robin, do you have another question?
I'll move it over to Anime Hunter.
Okay, so what do you think about like this, I don't know, meta meaning of existence? And I don't mean that type of meaning or rather purpose that you get from God or something. I mean, you and I are conscious, and it seems like it's only that is now what do we do about it? Mm-hmm. People when they think about meaning, they just are limiting themselves to this life and what they're gonna do about that. And I just mean, your life, I am alive, you're alive.
Yeah.
What now?
Yeah, what is it about? Yeah, I understand you.
Exactly.
Yeah, most people confuse meaning with goals. Like I want to buy a house and marry a blonde and have 5 children, or be a director. I used to have that. That was one of my early goals. I became a director at 32, earlier than I could ever have imagined. And I realized there was nothing to it. But meaning is not goals. Meaning is something that fundamentally transcends space and time. Meaning is something a lot bigger than a human life. Meaning is something that is woven in the fabric of reality, of nature itself. It's something that you cannot escape. It's something that is there whether you know and acknowledge or not. You don't need to believe it. You don't need to understand it. You are serving that meaning or that eternal purpose. Another way to put it is to differentiate it from goals. You are serving that eternal purpose, that telos, which is the more technical word for it, that attractor that pulls nature in a certain direction and couches everything that happens in a context of meaning. You don't need to see it. You don't need to believe it. There's very little you need to do because you are immersed in it. It's like fish in water. And I think that meaning is the following.
Well,
think it is.
okay. I'll let you speak.
I think it is only through the particular state of consciousness we call life, this dissociated segment with a sort of topology that is folded in on itself to allow for self-reflection, to allow us to think about our thoughts, to ponder our emotions. When mind turns in on itself to investigate its own content at a meta level, it is this particular configuration of consciousness that we have in life that helps the mind of nature get a grip. I think before life, the mind of nature was instinctive. It's like being, whatever I say, it will be anthropomorphizing. So I ask you to interpret this with caution. But from a human perspective, it would be like being in a delirium. When you are not in control of your own mind, you don't know what's happening. You are assaulted by inner imagery, by inner feelings, and that's very stressful. A delirium. I think the mind of nature was in some way akin to a delirium, because the only way mind has to talk to itself and therefore make sense of itself to itself is to produce inner imagery. There is no other way for mind to talk to itself and try to make sense of itself than to produce inner imagery. So that's how the whole thing starts. But without higher level mental functions, inner imagery is chaotic. It is delirium-like. And through this particular configuration of mind, this dissociated alter that folds in upon itself, nature has escaped the delirium. Nature has sort of now, maybe not get a grip yet, because clearly we haven't, but at least contemplate what's going on and begin to pass some kind of value judgment, begin to tell itself, well, I like it when I do this, and I don't like it when I do that. So I should stop doing that and should do this instead. I think it is through us that this kind of mentation has become possible in nature. And that is the telos. That's why nature pushes towards life any chance it gets. Life is everywhere. Life is in unbelievable places on this planet that we would think it's totally antithetic to life, like, deep sea thermal vents in which water boils at 300 degrees and there is no sunlight at all, and all kinds of caustic, toxic mineral elements in the environment. And there is shrimp there, there are nematodes. Life goes everywhere where it possibly can. So the impetus, the psychological impetus towards life, despite life being such a shit show of suffering, that impetus is enormous, and it doesn't shy away from suffering. So what impetus can be greater than the impetus to avoid suffering? It is the impetus to get away from the delirium. And through us, I think nature is sampling that for the very first time.
Also, what I really like about your theory is that it explicitly tells that what we feel, our emotions, essentially that every type of qualia is real. Under materialism, one might say that, the feeling of love, the color of red, it's all just made up of, a lot of electrical signals in the brain, and it's just meaningless.
Yeah, it's all nothing.
Yeah, and your analytical idealism just says that no, it's like a real thing. It's fundamental.
Yeah,
at the deepest level. Also, let's elaborate on your idea. Do you think that that meaning is continuous? Like has that sort of adventurous element in it. Like a story, like good narrative, because there's no getting away from being conscious. It's not like everything will disappear into nothing. We have to live with that essentially forever. So you have this opportunity of, this, I don't know how to call it, never-ending story, but not literally.
Yeah.
Meaning in the beauty of the adventure of life, of being conscious, localized, and existing and feeling.
Look, I'm an analytic guy. I come at this from an objective, reason, logic, science-based perspective. I'm not really a meditator. You shouldn't expect any kind of, comforting spiritual insight from me, like you can from someone like Rupert, who is the real deal. So I'm not in a place of profound peace, because there are things that I now know and take very seriously, and which are discomforting, and that's what most people don't realize. People think that, oh, analytic idealism, our core subjectivity never ends, so it's all good, it's all great. Well, there is such a thing as the vertigo of eternity. If you've been there once, you know how bloody scary it is, the idea that you really are going to live forever. If you if you can really wrap your head around what this actually means, it is you recoil from it very quickly. It's the vertigo of eternity. Most of us, if I say you are really going to live forever, most of us translate that into the following: you are not going to undergo the suffering of death. Oh, and that's great. Yes, I am not going to undergo the suffering of death. So that's great. But no. That's not what I said. What I said is, you are going to live forever. Forget the suffering of death. You are going to live forever. It doesn't matter how long you make it, it's outside time. It's not about how long it is. It's not easy. Another thing that we can no longer do is dismiss emotions. As you said, materialists like Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist, he would go as far as to say that even empathy is the feeling of empathy that propels us to help other people or animals. Even that is just a silly byproduct of an evolutionary mechanism that evolved to increase our social cachet. Because if we help other people, then the tribe will value us, our social cachet will increase, and you'll probably get to screw a little bit more, have a few more children, and live a little longer because people like you and take care of you. And the feeling of empathy, oh, that's just, an internal representation. It's a useless byproduct of that. So you know what? If that's true, and you don't feel any empathy, it's okay. You can be a jerk, because feeling empathy is just a silly byproduct. Go ahead, be an egoistic jerk. Step on other people. No, none of this is real anyway. Love is an illusion. Hate is an illusion. Whatever traumas I have, I don't need to integrate. I don't need to work hard on my own psychology to be a better, more complete, more integrated human being. It's an illusion. Forget your emotions. So we are given license to repress, to ignore, to live unexamined lives, because we think when we die, whatever insights we get are for nothing anyway. They're going to disappear when we die. They are ephemeral contents of mind. The mind is an epiphenomenal. So whatever you learn, however you mature, whatever you integrate, whatever you comprehend, however better you get, at the end, it's all for nothing. And look, this is very comforting for a certain type of people, and that type is very common. Now, under analytic idealism, all of your insights will last forever. Whatever you learn will go into your dissociated alter while you are in life. Whatever you understand, whatever you grasp, those subtle and massive insights about life, the universe, and everything, they go into your alter, and when you die, they are released into a broader field. They are released to nature at large. Death is the harvesting. That's it. Look, there is a mythological reason why the what's the name of death? I forgot the name given in English for the figure of death. You know, that creature with a dark
The
Grim Reaper. Yeah.
the Green Reaper with a teeth. It's not for nothing that the Green Reaper has a teeth. Teeth is a harvesting tool. It's what you use to harvest. It's not for nothing that cultures practiced sacrifices, which I think is wrong. You don't need to kill somebody to give a gift to nature, because that person is eventually going to die anyway. You're much better off prolonging life so you can accumulate even more insights. So when you finally die, the gift is much larger. But the intuition behind human sacrifice and animal sacrifice is not completely nonsensical. You are giving a gift to God. It's just that it's a worse gift than God could have had if you hadn't killed. So you should not kill. It's nonsensical to kill. But you see, mythology and spontaneous cultural practices are what they are for a reason. It's not arbitrary nonsense. No, it's a misinterpretation of what's going on. But there is partial vision there. So you cannot escape the meaning of your life. If you suffer your entire life, there will be a unique perspective on that suffering that you will contribute to, quote, God. You will provide God with that perspective that God wouldn't have had if you hadn't lived a life of suffering. And something will change in nature because of that. It may take eons. It may be invisible because it's diluted over a gigantic universe. But you can rest assured that even if you live a short life of intense suffering, you are gifting the divinity something. Whether you like or not. If you hate it, too bad. There's nothing you can do about it.
So Trevor TDD asks, in the same way that I should assume that others around me are conscious agents because of the ways they can express emotions and think like I do, should one do the same to dream characters who express the same exact characteristics?
It's a difficult question. We know that if you suffer from dissociative identity disorder, there is indeed something it is like to be your dream characters. They are your other alters. People with dissociative identity disorder, about 24% of them, if I remember the latest numbers from the Harvard research, 1/4 of them approximately have dreams in which all of their alters, all of their multiple personalities, partake in the same dream concurrently, and they appear to the other alters as dream characters in the experience of the dreams that the other alters have. So suppose I had two alters, Alice and Bob, and then because I have DID, I have dissociative identity disorder, and I go to bed and I dream. Next day, when I go to my therapist, if Alice has executive control of my body, Alice will relate a dream experienced from the perspective of Alice, and in which she saw Bob in the dream. And then when Bob gains executive control, Bob will tell the therapist, last night I had a dream. It will happen to be the same dream that Alice reported. And Bob will say, and I saw Alice in my dream. Different alters experience the same dream from unique perspectives. So in the case of DID, yes, in about 1/4 of the cases of the patients, we know that you can have dreams in which dream characters actually have a conscious life of their own. It's still your own mind, but a dissociated segment of your mind. In other words, there is something it is like to be a dream character in about 1/4 of the patients with DID. Now, for the rest of us, it's much more difficult. Dream characters could be partly individualized complexities of a person's mind. Jung defended that point of view, that dream characters could be, secondary personalities, partial personalities that are forming in the so-called unconscious. and they present to you in dreams. So there is something, it is like, it may be something very simple, but there is something it is like to be those dream characters. But I think in other cases, it's not justifiable to say that every dream character in your dream actually has a conscious inner life of their own, because it's completely plausible, in my view, that the dream character could exist only as the image you see. In other words, there is no inner life behind it. There is nothing it's like to be the dream character. There is only the image that your dreaming mind produces. Because, when there is a house in your dream, you don't think that there is something it is like to be a house in your dream. You just say that house exists only insofar as I am imagining it in my dream. And why not apply the same reasonable rationale to some dream characters, to say that they exist only insofar as my experience of them from the outside? In other words, they are just surface, they are just veneer. There's nothing inside. There's nothing it's like to be like them. If I were put against a wall with a gun in my head and say, Bernardo, now you have to make a guess, and it has to be a binary guess, people without dissociative identity disorder, do their dream characters have inner life or not? I would say no, they don't. There's nothing it's like to be them. They are just allegorical or metaphorical productions of your own mind. They are an attempt of your mind to communicate to itself through the imagery it produces.
Okay, sorry, there was some.
Sorry, I'd like some elaboration. So, what makes it different than the case for rejecting solipsism? So, the reason we reject solipsism is because other people have the same extrinsic appearance, they behave like us, and so on. And that seems to apply also to dream characters. So, why do we reject solipsism on this basis, but say that dream characters probably are not dissociated alters on the same basis?
The difference is consistency and continuity. If your dream characters would reappear over the years, and they would grow as well, they would change like people change as they go through life, and they would remain consistent with the things that define them, then you could say, well, then I have reason to think that they have inner life just like I have. But if you dream of a clown tonight, and next night you dream of a lawyer, and there is no consistency and no continuity, then why would they have inner lives? I mean, your mind is capable of producing endogenously imagery that only exists insofar as the images. In other words, there's nothing behind the images. We know that. If you dream of a car, the car exists only insofar as you experience that car from the outside. You don't go thinking, well, there is an inner life to the car. So we know mind can produce this kind of superficial imagery. So why wouldn't that be possible when it comes to people imagery? I see no reason why that wouldn't be possible. So we can agree that it's possible, I think. And then the next question is, if it is possible, what reason do I have to think that although it's possible, it's still not what's happening? They do have inner life. Well, the reasons you would have would be consistency and continuity over time. And I'm not the only one saying that. Jung had visions, dreamlike wake visions. He would dismiss characters without continuity, but the ones that would keep on coming back, like Philemon and other, mythical characters that appeared in his visions, he would attribute some form of simple conscious inner life to them, which is, Jung's own conscious inner life, but dissociated from Jung. So in that sense, there would be something it is like to be Philemon. A part of Jung is dissociated into the character of Philemon. And Jung's mind talks to itself, by proxy through those dissociated characters. So he thought Philemon had inner life. But you have to have a reason to think that. I have never had consistent, returning, continuous dream characters appear in my dreams. The only consistent character has been myself in my dreams. So I cannot speak from experience.
Fair enough. So Lucas, do you want to ask a question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to apologize for the previous incident. Basically, I wanted to ask Bernardo um, if he could stillman perhaps a little bit the materialist or physicalist point of view, and to point out what is their perhaps stronger point of contention with the analytical idealism, considering that the framework seems to be trying to not be contradictory with the primary physicalist assumptions as far as our physics and quantum mechanics go.
Okay, Stillman physicalism. The rationale is the following. My experience of my mind is that it is unreliable, it is reactive, it is not self-consistent. My opinions change, my feelings change. It's very reactive stuff. It's not consistent over time. It's fairly unpredictable. That's step one. Step number two, there obviously is a world beyond our individual minds that we share. Because if I come home at night and I park my car in my carport and I go to sleep next morning and go down, and my car is right there where I left it. So the car was in some kind of context that maintains its state, even though my mind is not present, or my mind is not maintaining the state I call a car because I went to sleep. But in the morning, the car is still there. So the state called car was maintained by this world in which we live. And it is a shared world because if I ask you, if you're sitting next to me and I ask you to describe my study, you would describe it in a way fairly consistent with my own description of it. So clearly we share a world, and that world has some degree of independence because it maintains its own state regardless of whether I'm present or not. And since my mind is so unreliable and the world seems to be very predictable, my mind is not predictable, my emotional reactions are not very predictable, but the world is. I can write down equations and predict exactly how fast an object will fall, by how much it will accelerate every second, where it's going to fall. You know, ballistic equations will tell you where exactly the cannonball will land if you choose a certain angle. So the world seems to obey some very predictable, reliable regularities, and my mind doesn't. Therefore, the world is of a different kind than mind. We live in a world that is beyond my mind. That world is not itself mind because it's predictable, and it holds its own state because when I go down in the morning, my car is where I left it. Let's call that non-mind thing matter. The world is material. But wait a moment. I am material. I have a body. I am material. So I am made of that same non-mental thing. But I have a mind. So therefore, the matter of my body must create my mind. And if I die, my mind is over. That's Stillmaning materialism. Does that make you happy?
Well, it wasn't simply a Stillman question. The point was more that it doesn't seem to be immediately or epistemologically a point of contention with what you were saying or proposing, with what physicalism is originally proposing, other than the fact that there doesn't seem to be a method by which to measure mind at large or these consciousness waves, right? And so my point was more like what seems to be resistance to accept something like this mind at large, or something similar insofar as we don't have to name it that or name it conscious at all, but something, right, which is generative of matter or reality in some aspect, considering that that has to exist, right, for the particles and everything else to be.
I think the commonality that you're presupposing between materialism and analytic idealism is a lot less comprehensive than you seem to suggest. The commonality is the following. Both acknowledge an external world beyond individual minds. In other words, both reject solipsism. Both make inferences about things that exist but are not available to my personal direct experience. That's the sole commonality. Neither is solipsist. From here onwards, it's all different. I'll tell you where materialism goes wrong. It goes wrong in several places. First place it goes wrong. Okay, we are not solipsists, we and the idealists. So there is something beyond our personal mind. Now there is a horizon of things I can be personally acquainted with. That's the horizon of my own mind. And we accept that there is something beyond that horizon that we are not personally acquainted with. In other words, we are not solipsists. We don't think that it's all only our minds. There is something beyond our minds. Therefore, beyond the horizon of my mind, there is non-mind. There is the materialist world. Beyond the horizon of the earth, there is something that isn't earth, something that is non-mental, because my mind is reactive and unpredictable, and the world is not. What does the idealist say? The idealist would say, surely there is something beyond the horizon, but beyond the horizon of the earth, it's just more earth. It's just earth that you happen not to be directly acquainted with, but it's of the same kind. Beyond my personal mind, it's more mind. But this extra mind is very predictable, and my mind is not. Well, your personal mind has evolved to react to environmental pressures because it evolved within an ecosystem within which it had to compete for resources. So, of course, your mind is reactive. But to project that reactiveness to what is beyond the horizon, in other words, to a mind that did not undergo evolutionary pressures, that didn't need to react to environmental challenges, is anthropomorphizing without need. The common characteristic is subjectivity, not particular personality traits like whether you're emotionally predictable or not. That's ancillary stuff. That's nothing to do with the meat of the question. Beyond the horizon, it's more earth. Beyond the personal mind, it's more mind. And that mind that's beyond the personal mind did not evolve in an ecosystem. So it's not reactive. It unfolds according to its own stable archetypal patterns because it is what it is. Therefore, it's more mind. And if I do that, I don't fall into the trap of having to reduce mind to matter, because matter is a description. That's what matter is. When we say that piece of luggage weighs 50 kilos, that's a description of what it will feel if I try to lift that piece of luggage. That's what matter was originally, a description of mental, qualitative stuff. But then we reified it to the thing in itself. We say, well, the feeling of the weight of that piece of luggage, that's a creation of your brain. What really exists is the 50 kilos. This is ridiculous. It's replacing the thing described with the description. It's replacing the map with the territory. Sorry, replacing the territory with the map, and then trying to pull the territory out of the map. That's the hard problem of consciousness. You can't pull the territory out of the map. And then you say, well, with version 2.0, or maybe version 2.2, or maybe version 1,200 something, I will be able to pull the territory out of the map. I just need to make a better map. Well, good bloody luck with that. Go ahead with version 2, version 3, version 4 of the map. Keep trying to pull the territory out of the map. In the meantime, I'll go along with my life. I'm not going to sit and wait for you to perform an impossible miracle, because your problem is you replaced the territory with the map, and now you're trying to pull the territory out of the map. That's not going to work. You cannot pull the feeling of carrying weight from 50 kilos, because 50 kilos was the bloody description, not the thing in itself. And that's where it all goes wrong with materialism. So the commonality with idealism is very modest. It happens only in the beginning. We both agree solipsism is invalid. We both agree we need to make inferences about what is beyond the horizon, and we are not directly acquainted with that. We agree with that. The materialist says beyond the horizon, it's no longer Earth. The idealist says beyond the horizon, it's just more bloody Earth, which is what we know.
Next question is by me. So I was wondering if you could be an analytic idealist while leaning towards the idea that mind as large is metacognitive, because from the problem of fine-tuning and from having had spiritual experiences and reading about spiritual experiences, I've come to the conclusion that mind at large is more likely metacognitive than not. And I know you've had this discussion with Tom Campbell recently. So
Yeah.
can you be an analytic idealist while holding this view?
It's just a question of terminology. You absolutely can hold that view. It's not an incoherent view. It's a question of whether you have enough empirical evidence to justify the view, or whether you have to be more cautious about it. But if you feel that your personal experiences lead you there, then look, ultimately you have to be honest to yourself. If that's where you want to go, if that's where you feel the truth is, that's where you should go. And whether you call it analytic idealism or not is irrelevant, strictly speaking, but that's just formalism. It doesn't really matter. The analytic part of analytic idealism also entails that metacognition is something that evolves within alters, and it's not the starting point of nature. So you can certainly be an idealist. Whether you can use the analytic part, it's your choice. I would say strictly not quite. You would be maybe a quasi-analytic idealist. But what does it matter? It's just words. It's just, just labels. It doesn't matter. What matters is what you feel, taking the totality of your mental functions into account. What you feel is the right way to go. That's the only thing that matters, not the name you give to it. If you want to announce yourself as an analytic idealism in public, even though you have this divergence with me, I'm not going to protest it. I don't have a copyright or a patent on the name. Go right ahead, use it. Use the logo. I'm totally comfortable with it.
So the next question is from Dare. He says that in their own times, the philosophers Kant and Fichte were idealists. But of course, Hegel and Schelling did not count as such. Were you aware of this? And if so, what are your thoughts on it?
This is an endless discussion. Hegel is known as an absolute idealist. Now, was he an idealist or not? Who knows? Because if you read him in the original German, well, even if you read his translations, the guy was a master of obscurantism. It's like he tried not to be understood. He tried to write in this pedantic, unnecessarily complicated way that just aggravates me, and it aggravated Schopenhauer in his own time as well. So if you press me, I would say, well, Hegel has made a couple of important contributions. As Nietzsche said, arguably without Hegel there would have been no Darwin. Hegel introduced to the Western mind the idea of evolution, of a telos. And okay, I accept that. It is there. Okay, it is in Hegel. Even though I don't understand most of it, this part I do. It is there. Now, was he an idealist or not? What did he mean by the absolute? What about the phenomenology of spirit, the phenomenology of the spirit? Because in German, the words from mind and spirit are the same. So some people translate the phenomenology of spirit, other people translate the phenomenology of mind. Personally, I think he meant mind. That's what he meant with Geist. That's how the word Geist is normally used. So in that case, if the absolute was Geist, then yes, he was an idealist. But there are people who argue, no, that's not what he meant. The absolute was something else. Well, I don't know. It's not important to me what is the proper label. What's important is what I can understand, what I can make out from what he wrote. And there isn't much in the case of Hegel. In the case of Kant, it's difficult. And lots of neologisms, a very sort of long-winded way of writing, but there is clarity. And I don't think Kant was an idealist. What we call Kant's idealism, it's an epistemic form of idealism. What Kant said was that we cannot know anything beyond the phenomena, beyond experience. We cannot directly access the noumenal world, the world as it is in itself. But he was agnostic about the nature, the categorical basis of the noumena. He didn't say that it wasn't mind or that it was mind. So was he an ontic idealist? In other words, a metaphysical idealist? I don't think so. I think he was an epistemic idealist, but that's not the idealism we mean here. So you see, I just reversed what you said. I just said Kant wasn't an idealist and Hegel perhaps was. So who knows? You know, they are not around for us to ask anymore. I think we can be fairly certain about what Kant's position was, and it's just a matter of nomenclature, whether you want to use the word idealism for his position or not. I don't, others do. In the case of Hegel, it's more unclear because nobody really knows what he really meant. In the case of Schopenhauer, it's very, very clear. It's undeniable. The man was an idealist. So you just have to read it with attention. He wrote very clearly, in a very easy way. He was an idealist. Fichte probably was an idealist as well. I don't know enough to take a strong position here, but I
And
see.
Jung as well. He was obviously an idealist.
Oh, Jung very clearly was an idealist. Yeah, very clearly. If you read his corpus, he was one. Yeah.
So I have a question about psychedelics. So some recent studies on ayahuasca show some increases in brain activity correlated with the experience itself. Furthermore, some physicalists leverage the concept of traveling cortical waves being correlated with the DMT experience as an explanation. There is also the notion of functional connectivity, which sometimes increases. What are your thoughts on all that?
I haven't seen any paper showing a reliable increase in brain activity associated with psychedelics. There has been one many years ago, I think 2007, from Switzerland, but we know now that that was just because of the lack of temporal resolution in the PET scans that were used. In other words, the moment in which the scans were taken, which shows increased brain activity, that was not the moment when the psychedelic was active. That was afterwards. And afterwards, you get a metabolic rebound. Psychedelics press down your brain activity, reduce brain activity. But once the psychedelics leave your system, once the psychedelics are metabolized, your liver does its work, and you're psychedelic free, then there is a metabolic rebound in the brain. The brain starts sucking more blood to compensate for the starvation that it underwent during the psychedelic trance. And that's what was actually measured by PET scans in that first paper. A group in Switzerland has done now a modern study, 2017, I think, and arrived at the exact same conclusion that everybody else arrived. Psychedelics reduce brain activity. Now, there were slight increases reported in some of the papers, but they were attributed to experimental artifacts or the error bar, because every measurement has an intrinsic error bar. Measurements are not infinitely precise, and these little spikes were attributed to this kind of things, error bars, experimental artifacts. They were very small, not significant at all in comparison to the robustness of the activity reduction signal, which was very robust. So ayahuasca increasing brain activity, I haven't seen it. I did see a paper on ayahuasca that significantly reduced brain activity in the default mode network. And because the researchers used masking, they don't know what happened outside the default mode network. Nothing was stated, but in the default mode network, activity was reduced with ayahuasca. That's the paper I know. If something more recent came contradicting this, I am not aware of it yet. I would be very surprised, because now, after 10 years, these results are very, very robust. They have been repeated by multiple different teams using multiple different substances, multiple different measurement techniques, fMRI, PET, MEG, EEG, and the result is always consistently the same. Now, the other things you brought up, is there anything else that happens in the brain other than a reduction, a massive reduction in brain activity? Well, of course, the brain is a dynamic organ. Other things happen. There has been reported increase in functional connectivity. In other words, activity reduces, but whatever residual activity remains seems to be more coupled across different brain regions. There have been reports of increased activity variability. In other words, on the averages, activity reduces a lot, but the residual activity oscillates around that reduced level. There is variability around that reduced level. So that has been reported as well. The most robust thing that has been reported, at least according to the physicalist researchers themselves, the most robust effect next to reduction of brain activity. Reduction of brain activity is by far the most significant, most robust, biggest effect, most consistent as well. But what is number two? What's the next in line? The next in line is what they call brain entropy. It's part of what they call the entropic brain hypothesis. Several papers are now published on this. So the researchers themselves have converged towards this entropic brain hypothesis and abandoned the rest. They abandoned functional connectivity, they abandoned variability. They are focusing on the entropic brain. And so what is it? What is it that happens in the brain consistently under psychedelics? Brain noise increases a tiny little bit. They use words like complexity, entropy. What they mean is brain noise, brain activity that cannot, brain activity that doesn't obey any recognizable pattern. Noise, like a television set for no broadcaster, no channel. Rain, TV rain back in the day when free-to-air television still existed. That's what increases. Now, by how much does it increase? By 0.001 in a scale from 0 to 100. It is incredibly tiny. Because there is so much data, the researchers can argue that it is statistically significant. In other words, the effect exists. I don't think it actually does, but I'm not going to dispute that. I don't think it does because statistical significance is a completely arbitrary threshold. Somebody decades ago put his finger in the air and said, well, P factor below 0.5 is statistically significant, and if not, it's not. Well, that was completely arbitrary. P factors can be engineered. We talk about P factor engineering today. There are many academic journals now that refuse to publish papers relying on the threshold of statistical significance, relying on P factors, because we know that that thing is abused. We think that 60% of recent research on psychology is false because it relies on this artificial threshold of statistical significance. 60% of published research on psychology is bullshit because of this artificial threshold. So if you ask me, does that effect even exist? In myself, my answer to myself is no. Come on, it's nonsense. That's totally engineered. It means nothing. They found nothing. But in the discourse, because statistical significance is still recognized. We haven't found a better way yet, and we cannot have no way. Otherwise, we open the doors to all kinds of nonsense. So in the open discourse, I will say, fine, the effect exists, but the fact that it exists doesn't mean that it accounts for the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience. Because for the latter case, it's important how big the effect is. Even if it is significant, it is tiny. It is tiny. Significance only tells us that the effect exists, not how big it is. The effect is incredibly tiny. Not only that, from many of the placebo psychedelic pairs that they have analyzed, it goes the other way. Brain noise reduces, and those people also had the psychedelic trance. So, one black swan would be enough if you're trying to say that increased brain noise causes the psychedelic experience. If you find one pair in which you can say reliably that for this person who had the psychedelic experience, brain noise reduced, then your theory is gone. And there are many black swans. And not even if there were.
Oh, sorry.
Even if there weren't black swans, the effect is so tiny that it doesn't really count. It's preposterous to think that the most intense and rich experience that people can have in their entire lives is caused by a 0.001 increase in a scale of 0 to 100 in brain noise. Moreover, noise by definition, entropy or complexity by definition, have no structure. That's the definition of noise. And psychedelic experiences are highly structured. They are internally consistent. So how can noise account for a structured experience, even if the noise were big enough? for us to even contemplate the possibility. And moreover, third point, for the rest of our experiences, they don't correlate with noise. If you're dreaming, dream correlates with brain activations, not noise. If you're watching TV, your experience of watching TV correlates with activation patterns, not noise. Lucid dreaming correlates with brain activation patterns, not noise. But psychedelic experiences have nothing to do with activation patterns. They have to do with a percent increase in noise levels. I mean, this is preposterous. It is ridiculous. It's a worrying sign of where we are in our culture, that such a thing is put forward with pride, with a straight face, as a major scientific advancement. It's a travesty. We have abandoned completely our notions, our feeling for plausibility, in order to safeguard a metaphysical prejudice, materialism. That's the state of our culture today, for you.
How do these researchers account for the fact that the effect sometimes went the other way around? The entropic brain hypothesis with the
They don't. They don't. They just say, on average, the effect correlates with psychedelics. Actually, when I and Professor Ed Kelly published a criticism of this on Scientific American, the researchers replied, because in our criticism we say they are trying to explain the psychedelic experience based on tiny increases in, of all things, noise levels, preposterous. And in their reply, they said, well, we are not trying to explain the psychedelic experience. We are trying to account for it. And we went like, what the hell does this even mean? What is the difference between accounting for and explaining? The tone was that what they meant by accounting was to sort of inventorize the correlates. So it seemed to be that what they were trying to say is, look, whether it explains the psychedelic experience or not, we have inventorized the fact that slight increases in noise correlate with the psychedelic experience. It seems to me that that's what they were trying to say. But of course, if that had been the way they had been understood, nobody would be talking about their research. Because an inventory of what gets correlated with the psychedelic experience, if it doesn't explain it, it's irrelevant. Who cares? Who gives a bloody damn? So they got the success they got. People started talking about it because people interpreted it the way I and Ed Kelly interpreted, that they were trying to explain it. But they say, no, we were not explaining, we were just accounting for it. God knows what they mean, man. I have no idea.
I remember reading that article. They say that materialism is about accounting for psychological states in terms of brain states. And then they say, we're not materialists, we're not trying to do philosophy, we're trying to account for these psychological states in terms of brain states.
Oh no, just you said this is private. I don't know whether you're going to put it in public, but you have to keep in mind that science today is not only a vocation, it's a job. These people have to publish paper and justify the funding they get. And if they don't get funding, they don't get tenure, they don't get salary increases. So that's the world we live in. You have to keep this in mind. I'm not going to elaborate on this, but I'm sure you know what I mean.
This is indeed public, so.
Fine, it's okay to say this in public, because I'm stating facts. Science, doing science is now a job that has some criteria that you have to fulfill, otherwise you lose your job. So if you look back and you realize you've done nonsense for 5 years, what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? Say I've done nonsense for 5 years? Right.
I'll move on to Jack now. Jack?
Thanks. I got a question from Nomendic Monk. He asks, if human artifacts such as thermostats and computers aren't conscious, but are excitations of mind at large, what are they in contrast to more natural stuff, so to speak? Is there any difference between human-made objects and things that were in mind at large before our civilization began?
I don't think so. No fundamental ontological difference. No. I think a thermostat and a rock are pretty much the same. They are images of mental processes going on in mind at large, but which are not part of an outer. They are not within a discrete dissociative boundary. They are just parts of the big image that we call the inanimate universe. So a rock, a thermostat, a waterfall, a moon, a volcano, a supernova, all the same. The difference is when you get into biology, when you get into life. Now, living things, I think, are the image of dissociative processes in mind at large. Things that have a private inner life of their own. I think paramecium has it, an amoebum has it, I have it, my cat has it, trees have it. Every living thing has. I don't think a virus has, because a virus is not a living thing. It doesn't metabolize. A virus is more like a mineral, a particle, a very complex mineral, approaching a crystal.
Thank you.
So whatever viruses are going around, they don't have their own mind. It's nature doing it.
Yeah, I always wondered about the viruses. I suppose you've heard. I've never heard you speak about Chris Langan or his super tautology, which he calls the cognitive theoretic model of the universe. Now, as far as I understand it, which is not a lot because it's pretty dense, and I'm not that smart. But from what I've seen, I think there's some overlapping between your positions, or at least your position and his position, though he would phrase it totally different, and he would probably say that his theory would be better and more inclusive than yours. But do you, and that was meant as a joke, by the way, but do you think there is some overlap between your model and his model?
I have no idea. I don't know.
You have no idea?
About it. No.
Really?
I haven't read anything. I don't know anything about it. I haven't seen it in the literature, so I don't know.
Okay, then, well, I'll pick another question. But if you find the time or maybe interested, then because Christopher Langan has. Do you know him, by the way? Do you know of him?
No.
Apparently, he's a very, very smart man. One of the smartest men, with I think he has the highest IQ that's ever been recorded. He is alive. He
And he's an idealist.
Yes, and he says
no surprises there. But no, I don't know who he is. I've never seen.
Well, he's very controversial. That's probably why. And he doesn't have a big he doesn't have a big opinion of academics, or at least the academic state of today, or physicalists for that matter, or the nihilists and atheists in that sense. The people who are so adamantly against idealism because, well, for their own reasons. And he thinks that he's made his own ontology where the reality is fundamentally syntax based. I cannot explain more, but if you have to come across him, is CTMU it's called, the Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe, then I would love to hear your thoughts about it.
I should have seen this. Did he publish it in the technical literature? Because this name would have evoked in my mind, like, oh, I need to look at this cognitive model of the universe. I would have seen it. He probably didn't publish in the academic literature.
Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. I'm not too familiar with papers as much, but it's called the Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe, the CTMU. So CTMU.
He probably didn't publish. I don't think I would have missed something with this name.
You're a very smart man, and probably a lot smarter than most of us here, probably all of us. But I hope you can find something interesting there. And if not, fine. I'd like to. Okay.
The name is not completely strange. There was a point they put me in some kind of private email list with all kinds of big names, and Langton, I think.
Not Langton, Langan, Langen.
Oh, then I don't know.
Christopher Langan, no.
I don't know.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Well, do you have to know any idealist jokes?
Let's start thinking about wrapping this because it's 11 p.m. and I haven't had dinner yet.
You haven't had dinner? Oh, well.
No, not yet, because I got tied up in something. I was planning to have dinner before coming, but I couldn't. So it is what it is.
Oh, sorry. And I'm glad you can. Almost 3 hours. 3 hours now. Wow. Okay, then I'll just. Raman, do you have any questions that are important?
We can do this again. We don't need to do the 100 right now.
No, that was a joke. I wasn't meant to do all the 100. That would take 7 hours. That's not an issue. Now, I'm gonna ask Raman if he has one more question that he thinks that is important, or probably people are gonna send me messages now because they all want to have the last question. So, but if you can come back, do this again. I would love that. I will make it easier for you. At least you know what's going to happen. Yeah?
I do have a question in mind. So, Dr. Kastrup, you make sense of the fact of fine-tuning through constructivist point of view espoused by Dr. Marcus Miller, right?
Yeah.
But doesn't that mean that we don't really reconstruct what we see, we construct it?
So long as the construction is compatible with what's really going on outside, such that the information it provides allows us to survive, we can construct things that don't look at all like what's really going on. A dashboard of dials doesn't look at all like the storm and the winds outside the airplane.
But a dashboard of dials conveys accurate information about the storm.
That's the important thing. It has to be accurate. Even if it doesn't look at all like it, it has to be accurate. So the question is, do we construct something that is accurate? I would say clearly we do. I don't fall down invisible precipices that have not been accurately portrayed by my sense organs, if you know what I mean.
So if we construct, sorry, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, you alluded to Marcus. What's important to realize is that perception is not a passive thing. Perception is not just pixels. Perception goes through several steps of what you could call cognitive filtering, but you can also call cognitive construction. We don't see pixels, we see objects, we see narratives. If you are walking down the street and there is a house in flames and a woman crying on the sidewalk in front of the house, what you will see is not yellow, green, and gray pixels. What you will see is a person who lost her belongings inside that house, and therefore she's sad because of it. That's perception. Perception is a fairly complex mental function, and we know this from cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience. We know that we apply these constructive steps, inferential steps, before things are actually perceived. So my point regarding Marcus Miller, who says that the physical world is a first-person construction, and if everybody constructs their own sort of interface to the world, those constructs will tend to be the same. And Marcus sort of proves that mathematically, how you can have a physics of first-person perspective that works as a whole, that works, ends up being like a shared world, although it's constructed from a first-person perspective. So my allusion to his work was to try to make sense of the fine-tuning problem, because it's a very vexing problem for analytic idealism too. If you say that, you know, the universal consciousness is not metacognitive, it's not able to plan things ahead, then how the hell did the fine-tuning happen? Because the fine-tuning is really, really fine. It is preposterous to think of it as just like, you know, the throw of a dice. It's not a chance thing. What I thought was the most promising way to make sense of it was an evolutionary cosmology theory in which, yeah, I'm not going to get into that. It would take too long. But Marcus offered a better alternative, I thought. Because if you are cognitively constructing the world from a first-person perspective, then that construct has to make sense of the fact that you exist. It has to be consistent with your own existence as the constructor. Otherwise, you would have cognitive dissonance. The whole thing would tilt. If you are constructing a world that makes it impossible for you to exist in it, then how did the world get constructed? You know, this kind of paradox is not useful. That's not how it would happen. Whatever constructed interface we would generate from a first-person perspective would not only have to be accurate in the sense that you can fly the plane safely by instruments, but it would have to be cognitively compatible with your existence. In other words, it would have to be compatible with an inner narrative of self-existence. You would need to have a cognitive narrative intimately associated with perception, interwoven with perception, that allows for your existence. And that narrative that you constructed yourself is the fine-tuning. Because if there weren't fine-tuning, there would be no complexity. There would be no stars. There would be no atoms other than hydrogen and helium. And therefore, there would be no life, and therefore, there wouldn't be you. Would we construct a world in which we are not possible? Of course not. By definition, we wouldn't do that because we do exist. We are constructing the world. So we would therefore construct a world that is both accurate and cognitively consistent with our existence. Therefore, we constructed the universal constants, and we define them as what they are indirectly because we needed to accommodate our existence in our own construction. That's what I think is relevant in Marcus' approach. Now, notice, this is what I'm saying, not Marcus. Once I confronted Marcus with it, he said, I actually never thought about it. So I don't know what he thinks about it right now. But this is how his theory, his physics of first-person perspective helped me make sense of the fine-tuning to my own satisfaction.
I know you gotta leave very soon, but I'm just conflicted on one thing. So, in one case, our dashboard of dials is an accurate extrinsic appearance, but in the case of what you're proposing with the Miller, it's not an accurate dashboard of dials because there was no fine-tuning in actuality. We just made that up. So if you can summarize an answer to that briefly, because I know you really must go.
You have to take it one step further. It's not that there was no fine-tuning. It is that there was no physical universe. The physical universe is the construct. It is the dashboard of dials. So in constructing a dashboard, we had to construct one that would be both accurate, in the sense that the dials reflect useful information about the states of what is really going on outside, so we can fly safely by wire. Even though the dials don't look like the world, they represent the world in an accurate way. But it would also have to be a dashboard, a set of dials, that at a higher level of cognition would leave space available for our existence. Because if the story of the dials would be such that our existence is impossible, then the dials are impossible, and therefore that construct wouldn't work. So yes, without our construct, there would be no fine-tuning because there would be no physical universe. The physical universe is the construct, and the construct has to make space for our existence. Therefore, we constructed a physical universe that is fine-tuned. That's the point.
Okay.
Okay.
I think we have loads of more questions, but you have to eat, and it's been 3 hours, so we
All right.
Wait, is there still someone on the stage?
Eu me comunico melhor em português. I communicate better em português. E se eu Castruco saber falar nessa língua, eu me saio melhor.
He said he's speaking in Portuguese because he knows I understand Portuguese. I had difficulty understanding him, but his suggestion is that I should speak in English because I should speak in Portuguese because it would be better. You are saying this because you never heard me speak in Portuguese. Otherwise, you'd have other thoughts about the matter, I suspect. But anyway, thanks everybody for this. I will come back maybe after you publish this, so everybody can see the questions that are already answered, so we don't need to repeat it. Then we can make another appointment.
I would love to do that. And thank you so much for your time, so much, and have a great day.
I had so much fun.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
It's fine, Bernardo.
Okay.
Have a good night. Have a good night.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.